The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Evelyn Hart's father threw her trunk down the front steps of the only home she had ever known. She hadn't seen it coming, or maybe she had, and had simply refused to look at it directly, the way you avoid staring at something that will blind you if you do. Her father stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, and his jaw set in that particular way that meant the conversation was already over before it started. Stepmother stood just behind him, not saying anything, which was somehow worse than if she had screamed. "You've been nothing but a burden," her father said. Not loudly. That was the thing about Raymond Hart, he didn't need volume to wound. 3 years I've kept you fed and housed out of obligation to your mother's memory. That obligation is finished. The trunk hit the step and split at the corner, spilling 2 wool dresses and a pair of worn boots onto the frozen ground. Evelyn stood on the front walk and did not cry. She was 23 years old. It was the 3rd of January, 1887, and the temperature had dropped below 0 overnight. She had $11.40 in her coat pocket, a tin photograph of her mother, and no idea what she was going to do next. Picked up the boots. She picked up the dresses, closed the broken trunk as best she could, and dragged it to the end of the lane. And she did not look back at the house, because she knew if she did, she would see the curtain move in the front window, where her stepmother was watching, and that would be worse than anything her father had said. That was the moment everything changed. Not the storm that came later, not the man who would become her husband, not the frozen wilderness that would test every limit she thought she had. It was this, a split trunk on frozen ground and a door that closed behind her with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. If you've ever been told you were not worth keeping, then you already know what Evelyn felt standing there on that empty lane. And if you haven't watched this story carefully, because what she did next is the only answer that has ever mattered. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, subscribe to the channel and hit the like button so you don't miss a single story. Drop your city or country in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story has traveled. People from all over the world find their way here. And every time I read those comments, it reminds me why these stories matter. Now let's go back to Wyoming, 1887, and to a woman who had nothing left to lose. The town of Harlan Creek, Wyoming, did not appear on most maps, which suited the people who lived there just fine. It sat in a valley between 2 ridgelines that trapped the cold air in winter and kept the summers short and grudging. There were maybe 400 people within 20 miles of the post office, if you counted generously, and most of them had arrived the same way, running from something, or chasing something, and landing here when they ran out of road. Post office was also the general store, and on Saturdays the unofficial courthouse for whatever disputes the valley's residents couldn't resolve on their own. Postmaster, a heavy-set man named Gerald Fitch, handled mail-order bride correspondence as a sideline, since the territory had more solitary men than it had women willing to come this far for any reason at all. Kept a small ledger of names ranchers and homesteaders who had written off to agencies in Chicago and St. Louis and Pittsburgh, and he matched letters when he could, and tried not to think too hard about what happened after. Caleb Thorn had not come to Fitch looking for a wife. He had come because his housekeeper of 6 years, a Crow woman named Maggie Two Horses, had told him flat that she was going to her sister's family in Montana and wasn't coming back. She'd packed her things on a Thursday morning, looked at Caleb across the kitchen table, and said, "You need someone who'll stay." Caleb had not argued. He wasn't a man who argued. He'd nodded once, said he hoped the journey wasn't too hard, and then stood in the kitchen after she left and looked at the cold stove and felt something he didn't have a name for and didn't especially want to examine. He was 38 years old. He had been running the Thorn Ranch alone, more or less, for the last 9 years. The ranch covered 1,100 acres of valley floor and low foothill country, with good water from a creek that ran year-round, even in the worst winters. He ran cattle about 200 head most years, less when the winters were bad, and he had 4 hands who worked the operation. He was not a wealthy man by any measure that involved comfort or warmth, but the land was paid for, and the cattle were good stock, and the bank in Laramie had no claim on him, which in 1887 put him ahead of most ranchers in the territory. What Caleb Thorn had was land and silence, and he had organized his life around both of them so thoroughly that he had almost forgotten that one of them was not actually a choice. Fitch had suggested the arrangement with the directness of a man who didn't believe in wasting words. "You need someone to run the house. There are women back east who need a situation. Write a letter. I'll send it off." Simple as that. Nothing about it is simple, Caleb said. No, Fitch agreed. But it's practical. And you're a practical man. Which was true. Caleb was so practical that he had written the letter that same afternoon at Fitch's desk, in handwriting that was functional rather than elegant. He had described the ranch, the work, the isolation, and his own character with the same tone he would have used writing an inventory of his livestock. He had not promised warmth. He had not promised affection. He had said that he needed a woman who could work hard and weather difficult conditions, and that he could offer security and a permanent home, and that he would treat her with respect. That was the word he'd used. Respect. He'd stared at it for a long moment after he wrote it, then folded the letter before he could second-guess himself. The agency in Chicago had matched him with Evelyn Hart within 6 weeks. He had not expected her to actually come. Evelyn had read his letter 4 times in the small room. She was renting above the laundry on Calhoun Street in Chicago, where she had been working 12-hour shifts, running sheets through the mangle press for 3 weeks, which was long enough to understand that she could not sustain that life, and long enough to be desperate enough to answer an advertisement she would have ignored in different circumstances. The advertisement had been straightforward. Wyoming rancher, 38, seeks capable woman for practical marriage arrangement. Hard work required. Isolation considerable. Honesty preferred over sentiment. She had almost laughed when she read it. Almost. But there was something in its refusal to dress itself up that she found more honest than anything else on the agency's board. She wrote back. She told him the truth that she had no family she could rely on, that she had some experience keeping house and managing a kitchen garden and caring for animals, that she was not fragile and did not intend to become so, and that she understood the difference between a practical arrangement and a fairy story and was interested in the former. She had not told him about her father throwing her out, because that felt like information that might make him question her value rather than her situation. And she had learned enough about how the world worked to understand the distinction. His response had taken 3 weeks. It was shorter than the first letter. If you are serious, come. Train to Laramie, stagecoach north to Harlan Creek. I will meet you at Fitch's store, C. Thorn. No question about her age. No question about her appearance. No statement of welcome or reassurance. Just logistics. She had stood in the freezing post office on Calhoun Street, holding that letter, and thought, he's either the most practical man alive or the least feeling one. Then she thought, does it matter? What are the alternatives? She'd bought her ticket the next morning. Stagecoach from Laramie took 2 days, and by the time it reached Harlan Creek, Evelyn had lost all sensation in her left foot and had consumed her last piece of hard cheese somewhere around midday on the second day. There were 2 other passengers, a land agent, who slept most of the way and smelled of pipe tobacco, and a young woman named Clara, who was going to join her brother's household, and who had cried, quietly and persistently, for most of the first day. Evelyn had not cried. She'd looked out the window at the landscape that was nothing like anything she had known the scale of it. The emptiness, the way the mountains sat against the sky like something put there to remind you how small you were, and she'd thought, all right, this is what it is. Figure out what comes next. The coach pulled into Harlan Creek just after 3 in the afternoon, and the cold hit her when the door opened like something physical, like a hand pressing against her chest. She stepped down onto the frozen mud of the main street and stood there with her battered trunk and her worn coat and looked around at a town that seemed to consist of 1 street, a dozen buildings, and a silence so complete that she could hear the wind moving through the spruce trees at the edge of town. Fitch's store was the biggest building on the street. She didn't have to be told. She picked up one end of her trunk and dragged it across the frozen ground toward it. The man who had become her husband was standing outside the store with his back to the door and his hat pulled low against the wind. She recognized him from the photograph he had sent, or rather, she recognized the general shape of him, because the photograph had been taken from a distance and had conveyed mostly that he was tall and wore a coat. In person, he was broader than she'd expected, with the particular kind of stillness that belongs to men who have spent years working alone in big, quiet country. He was watching her come across the street with an expression that she couldn't read, which she would later understand was simply his default expression. She stopped in front of him. He looked at her for a moment, then at the trunk, then back at her. Miss Hart, he said, Mr. Thorn. A pause. Not an uncomfortable one exactly. More the pause of 2 people who have both written things they meant and are now standing in front of the actual situation they've agreed to. Rough trip? He said. Long, she said. Cold. It doesn't get much warmer. So I'm given to understand. He looked at her for another moment, then bent and picked up her trunk like it weighed nothing, which told her something about him immediately, and carried it to the wagon without another word. She followed. She was not going to pretend this wasn't strange or frightening, but she was not going to let either of those things show on her face, because she had the instinct already that showing weakness in front of this man would be a mistake, not because he would use it against her, but because he would dismiss her, and she could not afford to be dismissed. The ride to the ranch took an hour and a half, and they spent most of it in silence. Not the uncomfortable kind. Not the kind where two people are both thinking of things they don't know how to say. The silence on that wagon ride was more like the silence between two people who have both been alone, long enough that silence doesn't feel like absence. About halfway there, Evelyn said, "What happened to your housekeeper?" He glanced at her sideways. "She left, went to Montana." "Did she say why a beat?" "She said I needed someone who'd stay." Evelyn considered that. "And you think I'll stay?" "Don't know," he said without defensiveness or apology. "What we'll find out." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in months, possibly years. She looked out at the land unrolling ahead of them, the brown grasses under their skim of snow, the dark line of the tree row along the creek, the mountains closing in on the northern horizon, and felt something settle in her chest that was not quite peace and not quite hope, but was maybe the first cousin of both. The ranch came into view around a long curve in the road. She had formed a picture of it in her mind during the weeks of preparation, and the picture was wrong in nearly every detail, not worse than she'd expected, just different. The main house was low and wide, built from dark timber with a long porch running across the front. There were several outbuildings, a barn that looked recently repaired on one side, two corrals with the remnants of a snow fence along the north. A windmill turned slowly in the cold air. Smoke came from the chimney. It was not warm. It was not welcoming, but it was solid, and that mattered to her more than warmth at the moment. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down, and she climbed down after him, without waiting to be helped, which he noticed, though he said nothing about it. One of his hands appeared from the direction of the barn. A young man, maybe 20, with a gap-toothed face and the posture of someone perpetually expecting to be told he'd done something wrong. He stopped when he saw Evelyn and pulled off his hat. "That her?" he said to Caleb. "That's her," Caleb said. The young man put his hat back on. "Huh." He looked at her with open curiosity, not unkindly. "You really come all the way from Chicago?" "I did," Evelyn said. "What'd you come out here for?" He seemed genuinely puzzled, the way a person is puzzled by a decision they cannot imagine making themselves. "Same reason as anyone," she said. "Looking for something worth staying for." He seemed to think about this, and then apparently decided it was a satisfactory answer, because he nodded once and went back to the barn. Caleb, standing beside her, said nothing, but she had the distinct impression that he'd been listening. The interior of the house was almost aggressively functional. There was a kitchen with a cast-iron stove that was doing its job adequately, and a long wooden table that had the look of something built by a man who valued durability over aesthetics. There was a main room with 2 chairs and a cold fireplace, and a window that looked south, which was the sensible direction for a window in this country. The floors were bare-board. There were no curtains. There was an oil lamp on the kitchen table and another on the mantel, and that was the sum total of what might be called decoration. There was also, she noticed immediately, a layer of grime on most surfaces that spoke to months of inattention, not filth exactly. The slow accumulation of a house that has been cleaned minimally by a man who cooks for himself and doesn't notice most things. She did not say anything about this. Not yet. Caleb showed her the bedroom that would be hers separate from his, which she noted with a complicated mixture of relief and something else she wouldn't examine, and said, "There's water in the pitcher. Supper's at 6, the hands eat after." He said all of this with the manner of a man reciting information rather than making conversation. "Who cooks supper?" she asked. A pause. "I do, mostly." "What does mostly mean?" "It means I cook what I know how to cook, and there isn't much variety." She nodded. "I can cook supper." He looked at her. Couldn't tell if he was grateful or annoyed, and she suspected he wasn't sure either. "You just got here," he said. "I know," she said. "But I'm not fragile, and I'd rather be useful than sit in a room wondering what to do with myself." He was quiet for a moment. "Then there's salt pork and dried beans. Cornmeal. Some canned tomatoes from last fall that might still be decent." "I'll manage," she said. He left her to it. Kitchen took her about 3 minutes to assess and about 20 to get under control enough to cook in. She found a pot that was serviceable, a skillet that needed seasoning badly, and a cast-iron Dutch oven in the back of the lower cabinet that someone had put away clean, told her that Maggie Two Horses had cared about her work, and that whatever else the situation was, it had not been careless before. She soaked the beans for 30 minutes while she dealt with the salt pork, got the fire built up properly in the stove, found the canned tomatoes, and opened them with the knife on the counter that someone had sharpened recently. She made a stew that was honest rather than elegant good smoked salt, dried onion, a little cornmeal to thicken it, the tomatoes cut up and stirred in near the end. It wasn't a sophisticated meal, but it was the kind of thing that tasted like effort and warmth, which, in this kitchen, at this temperature, was more valuable than sophistication. Caleb came in at 6 o'clock and stopped when he walked through the door. She had cleared the table and wiped it down, and lit the lamp, and the stew was in a bowl in the middle, with the Dutch oven underneath it to keep it warm. It was not a dramatic transformation, but it was different from what he had left. He sat down without saying anything. She put a bowl in front of him and sat across the table with her own. Tasted it. A pause. Then it's good. It's simple, she said. Simple's fine. He ate for a moment. Where'd you learn to cook? My mother. Before she died. He nodded once. Did not offer condolences, which she found she preferred to the hollow version people usually gave. How old were you? He said. 14. You had people after that? My father, she said, and left it at that, in a tone that invited no further questions on the subject. He took the hint with the ease of a man who had things he didn't discuss himself. They ate the rest of the meal in silence, but it was a different silence than the wagon ride warmer. Slightly, or maybe just less cautious. When he finished, he pushed back from the table and said, I'll check the cattle. You don't need to wait up. I'll clean up and go to bed, she said. I'm tired, fair enough. He picked up his coat from the hook by the door, then stopped, with his hand on the latch. Without turning around, he said, It's colder at night than it is during the day. There are extra blankets in the chest at the foot of your bed. It was so small a thing. The kind of thing you say to someone staying in a spare room, not anything more. But she thought, later, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the windwork at the eaves of the house, that it was the first time he had offered her something without being asked. She pulled the extra blankets over herself and closed her eyes, and outside the Wyoming winter pressed in from all directions, and the Thorn Ranch creaked and settled around her like a living thing, getting used to the weight of a new presence, and she thought, all right, this is where I am. Figure out what it means. She woke before dawn, which she had been doing for years, and went to the kitchen and started the stove before anyone else was up. She found flour and lard and made biscuits, which she had done so many times in her life that her hands knew the proportions without her brain needing to get involved. She made coffee strong enough to stand on its own. When Caleb came in from the cold at 5:30, he found her at the stove in the kitchen, smelling of things that apparently hadn't smelled of in a while. Stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything. Then he went to the coffee pot, poured himself a cup, and sat at the table, and that was that. The first hand in was the gap-toothed young man from the day before, whose name was Pete. He came in and saw the biscuits, and his face did something simple and unguarded. Not joy, exactly, but a kind of uncomplicated pleasure that was almost more moving. Morning, ma'am, he said. Morning, she said. Sit down. He sat. He ate 3 biscuits before he said anything else. The other hands came in over the next 20 minutes, a lean, weathered man named Roy who barely spoke, a stocky man called Dutch, who had arrived from somewhere in the Dakotas 3 seasons ago and had opinions about everything, and a boy of maybe 17 named Thomas, who had the look of someone still surprised to find himself a working man. They were not impolite. They were uncertain, in the way that men who have organized their lives around the absence of women are uncertain when a woman appears in the middle of it. They glanced at her, and at each other, and ate their biscuits, and said thank you when she refilled the coffee. Dutch, who had opinions about everything, said, "You cook like this every morning?" I intend to, she said. He seemed to be recalculating something. Caleb usually just does cornmeal mush. I know how to make mush, she said. But biscuits are better. Roy, who barely spoke, said, They are. Pete laughed at this, a short, genuine laugh that seemed to surprise him as much as anyone. Caleb, at the head of the table, said nothing. But she caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, not warmth, not resistance. Something in between. Something like the face of a man who has decided to wait and see, which she understood because it was the same face she was making and had been making since the moment she stepped off the stagecoach. 3 days after she arrived, she found the condition of the main house's supply room. It was not a disaster in the catastrophic sense. It was a disaster in the slow, grinding sense of things that have been neglected, not from carelessness, but from a man who did not know what order looked like, or had stopped being able to see it. The root cellar had 3 barrels of potatoes, most of them still good, but stored badly enough that she could see some rot starting at the edges of the pile. There was a sack of cornmeal with a hole in it from mice. There were 2 cured hams hanging from the ceiling that were fine, and 2 that were not. There were preserves. Someone had put up preserves, probably Maggie, but they were stored incorrectly, and a quarter of them had gone to seal failure. Stood in the middle of it for a few minutes, doing the arithmetic in her head. The winter ahead. How many mouths? What they had, what they were going to need, what could be saved and what was already gone. Then she went and found Caleb in the barn. He was working on a harness alone. He looked up when she came in without calling out first, which was something she did without thinking. She had spent enough of her life announcing herself and waiting to be let in that she had developed a tendency to simply go where she needed to go. The root cellar has problems, she said without preamble. If we don't deal with it in the next few days, you're going to lose another quarter of those potatoes, and the small ham on the east hook is going. He looked at her for a moment. I was going to get to it. When? A pause. It matters now, she said, not unkindly but without softness either. Can I have Pete and Thomas help me tomorrow? Just for the morning. Another pause. Longer this time, she could see him working through it, the decision of whether to take direction from her, or resist it, or simply do the thing she'd suggested and call it his own idea. She had known men who would have done that third thing. She waited to see which kind he was. I'll have Pete help you, he said finally. Thomas has fence work. Pete's enough, she said. Turned to go, he said. The ham was going before you got here. Stopped. Looked back at him. He wasn't looking at her, he was looking at the harness, working the leather through his hands. I know, she said. I'm not blaming you for it. She left him there, and went back to the house, and that night at supper, he ate 2 helpings of the salt pork and potato stew she'd made with the potatoes that had been closest to the edge, and he didn't say anything about it. But he also didn't up from the vet table the moment he was finished, the way he had the first 2 nights. He sat there for a few minutes with his coffee, and Pete was still eating. And Dutch was telling some long story about a horse he'd once known in the Dakotas, and the lamp was lit and the stove was warm. And Evelyn, clearing the counter behind them, thought, this is what a house is supposed to feel like. Forgotten it. She wondered who had made him forget it. She wondered if it was any of her business to find out. It was Roy who told her at the end of her first week, on a morning when she and Roy happened to be the only ones in the kitchen, and he had come in early for coffee, and she had been reorganizing the shelf above the stove. She hadn't asked. She had learned long ago that asking was often the worst way to get information, and that if you were simply present and patient and didn't make a person feel observed, they sometimes told you things they'd been carrying for a long time. Roy wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and looked at the table and said, he had a wife. Before Evelyn kept working on the shelf, I guessed. 7 years ago, she died in the second winter. Their child, too. Fever took them both inside a week. He paused. He didn't talk for 3 months after. Just worked. Wouldn't look at anyone straight. Evelyn stopped what she was doing, but she didn't turn around. Then he just kept working, Roy said, and kept working. That's it. That's all he does. He runs a good ranch, she said. He runs a perfectly fine ranch, Roy agreed. He just doesn't live in it. She thought about that for the rest of the day. That evening, when Caleb came in for supper and sat down and looked at his food and started eating with the careful, efficient manner of a man who eats because the body requires it, she looked at him across the table and thought, there you are. Not the closed-off rancher who'd picked her up at Fitch's store. Not the practical man who'd sent 2 letters and expected nothing more. The other one. The one who had learned to survive by becoming a man who needed nothing, because needing things was the same as giving the world a way to hurt you. She was not going to fix that. She was not here to fix him, and she understood the difference between a woman who thought she could change a man and a woman who understood that change, if it came from within, could see it now, which meant she could be careful with it. She could be the person who stayed. That was all. Just stayed. She passed him the bread without being asked, and he took it without looking up, and that was all, and it was enough for now. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved through the valley, like something that had been moving through it for 1,000 years before either of them was there, and would be moving through it long after they were gone. and the lamp on the table made a small circle of light in the middle of all that dark. And Evelyn Hart thought, all right, this is where I am. She did not know yet what the winter would bring. She did not know about the storm that was building its strength somewhere to the north, or what it would ask of her, or what she would find out about herself when it came. She did not know that the valley was watching her and forming its opinions, and that some of those opinions were not kind, and that those unkind opinions would arrive at the ranch in various forms before the winter was out. She only knew that the stove was warm, and the food was good, and there were men at this table who had eaten better this week than they had in months, and that the man at the head of it had, twice now, sat longer than he needed to, as if the room had given him something he hadn't expected, and he wasn't quite ready to give it back. It was not much, but it was real, and Evelyn, who had lived long enough to understand the difference between what was real and what was merely promised, knew that real was where you started. The talk started before her second week was out. She heard it first from Pete, who was not the kind of person who could carry a secret for long, not out of malice, but out of the simple inability to keep his face from showing what was in his head. Came in from town on a Friday afternoon, where he'd gone for supplies, and he was quiet through supper in a way that was not natural to him. And Evelyn, who had been watching people's faces long enough to read the difference between tired and troubled, said nothing until he was finishing his coffee. Then she said, "What did they say in town?" Pete looked up, then at Caleb, who wasn't in the room, then back at her. "Nothing worth repeating. Tell me anyway." He turned his cup in his hands. "Mrs. Alderman at the dry goods." She said he stopped. "Tried again." She said mail-order brides come west for two things, the land or the money, and that it's usually the land. Evelyn looked at him steadily. "What did you say?" "Nothing. I didn't know what to say." He seemed genuinely ashamed of this. "I should have said something." "You don't need to fight my fights for me," she said. "I know, but he set his cup down. It wasn't just her. Frank Dunbar was in there. He said if Caleb wasn't careful, he'd find himself married to a woman with a plan." Quiet for a moment. In the kitchen, the stove ticked and settled. Outside, the wind was doing what the wind always did in this valley, pressing at the walls as if checking for weaknesses. "Caleb hear any of it?" she said. "Don't think so." "Then let's leave it there for now." Pete nodded, clearly grateful to be let off the hook. But after he'd gone, she stood at the kitchen window for a long time, looking at the yard below, where the light was going fast, and the cold was coming down from the mountains, the way it did every evening, like a deliberate thing. She was not surprised. She'd understood from the moment she'd decided to come west that she would be carrying the weight of what people assumed about women who made the choices she'd made. She had simply hoped for a few more weeks before it started in earnest. The thing about being misjudged is that it isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a door that doesn't open quite as wide as it would for someone else. Sometimes it's a conversation that stops when you walk into the store and then resumes a half beat too late in a slightly different register. Evelyn had been misjudged enough times to know all the varieties of it, and she had learned that fighting the loud kind was less important than ignoring the quiet kind, because the quiet kind was the one that could actually get inside you if you let it. She didn't tell Caleb, not because she was hiding it from him, but because she didn't yet know what telling him would accomplish, and she had the strong instinct that a man who trusted carefully would not thank her for presenting him with someone else's opinion before she'd given him a reason to trust his own. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark listening to the ranch settle around her and thought about her mother, who had been misjudged in her own time and in her own ways, and who had dealt with it by being so thoroughly and unapologetically competent that the misjudgment eventually embarrassed the people who'd held it. Evelyn was her mother's daughter. She would do the same. The second week she was there, the old milk cow developed a problem with her left rear hoof that had gone unnoticed long enough to turn from a minor thing into a more serious one. Dutch noticed it first and mentioned it at breakfast, in a tone that suggested it was being mentioned to Caleb rather than to her. But Caleb wasn't at the table yet, and it landed in the middle of the room without a destination. "She's favoring it bad," Dutch said. "Probably needs to be looked at." "I'll look at it," Evelyn said. Dutch blinked. "You know cattle hooves?" "I know some." Which was true. Her mother's family had run a small farm in Pennsylvania. She had spent enough of her childhood in barns to understand the basics of animal care in the way people who grow up near animals simply absorb it without formal instruction. She went out after breakfast and found the cow in the barn and cleaned the hoof and found the issue a crack that had started at the edge and been left long enough for a small infection to take hold in the soft tissue. She packed it with the turpentine and lard mixture she'd found in the supply shed, which was the treatment she knew and which, if applied consistently, would manage the situation without the expense of a veterinarian. She spoke to the cow the whole time, not in a cooing way, but in a low, matter-of-fact voice, because animals responded to consistency and tone rather than content, and this one was anxious and needed calming. Caleb found her there an hour later when he came into the barn for something else entirely. Stood at the entrance of the stall and looked at her for a long moment, at the carefully packed hoof and the clean rags she'd used, and the cow standing easier already. "When did you learn that?" he said. "I grew up around animals. You didn't mention it. You didn't ask." He leaned against the stall post and crossed his arms. He was wearing that expression again, the waiting one, the not quite decided one. "Going to need packing every 2 days for a couple of weeks," she said. "I know, I'll do it. I can. I know you can," she said, not impatiently. "But I'm going to be here and I may as well be useful." "That's what I said I'd be." He was quiet. "Then you said you knew some. About hooves, I do. The packing is right. I didn't want to say so because I wasn't sure you'd done it correctly, but you did." She looked up at him. It was possibly the longest thing he'd said to her that wasn't logistics, and it had the particular quality of something said carefully, by a man who did not give assessment casually. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and went to get what he'd come for, and she finished with the cow, and that was that. Something had shifted, some very small calibration, like a door that has been sticking in its frame and finally moves. By the end of the second week, she had made a more thorough inventory of the house than even she had intended. Because once she started, she found she couldn't stop. The way you find one thing that needs doing and follow the thread until you understand the whole shape of the neglect. The house was structurally sound. Whatever else Caleb Thorn was or wasn't, he was not a man who let physical things decay if he knew how to prevent it. The roof was good, the foundation solid, the windows sealed. Inside of the house had been lived in rather than cared for, which was a different thing. There were 2 windows in the main room that had been lacking their curtains, for long enough that no one remembered what had hung there before. The fireplace in the main room had not been used all winter, because the damper needed adjusting, and no one had adjusted it. Kitchen shelving needed re-securing, because 2 of the brackets had worked loose, and the whole thing listed slightly to the left, which had apparently been accepted as a permanent condition. She fixed the damper herself, which required a morning of cold, filthy work lying on her back in the fireplace with a screwdriver, and the satisfaction she felt when she lit the fire that evening and the room filled with warmth was more than the sum of its practical value. Pete stood in the doorway and stared at the fire like it was something he'd forgotten existed. "That fireplace hasn't worked since before I got here," he said. "The damper was seized," she said. "It just needed breaking free." Caleb said it was broken. "It wasn't broken," she said. "It was stuck. Those are different things." Pete nodded, with the expression of a young man absorbing a lesson that was probably applicable to more than fireplaces. Caleb, when he came in that evening, stopped in the doorway of the main room and looked at the lit fireplace for a long moment. He didn't say anything. He sat in one of the chairs nearest it, which he had apparently never used before because it was the one farthest from the door, and he sat there with his coffee and looked at the fire. And Evelyn, passing through, left him to it. She would not make a thing of it. She understood intuitively that he was a man to whom things had to be offered rather than given, who would accept something slowly if it was simply there and available, but would close against it if he felt he was being managed. She simply kept the fire lit. The 3rd week brought the first real trouble. A man named Gerald Dunbar Frank's older brother, as it turned out, came to the ranch on a Wednesday morning while Caleb was out checking the far cattle. He arrived on horseback, alone, and tied his horse at the fence and came to the kitchen door rather than the front, which told her something about the kind of visit he thought this was. Gerald Dunbar was 60 or so, with the weathered, entrenched look of a man who had been in this valley long enough to believe he owned a portion of the air in it. He had a large spread to the east. She'd heard Pete mention it, and he and Caleb had what Dutch described as an arrangement, which Dutch said with a tone that suggested the arrangement mostly benefited Dunbar. Took off his hat when she opened the door, which was courtesy, but he looked at her with an assessment in his eyes that was not courtesy at all. "You're the wife," he said. "I'm Mrs. Thorn," she said. A small pause. They had not yet formalized the marriage. There was a justice of the peace in Harlan Creek, and the arrangement had been made that they would go before the end of the month. But she used the name anyway, because she had the strong instinct that this man would treat her differently depending on what she called herself. and she was not interested in being treated differently. "Come to see Caleb," he said. "He's not here." "Can I give him a message? When will he be back?" "Not certain this afternoon." Dunbar looked past her into the kitchen for a moment, in the way of a man accustomed to looking into other people's houses, as if they were already his business. "I'll wait." "You're welcome to wait in the yard," she said pleasantly. "Cold. I'll tell him you came." Something shifted in his face, not anger, not quite. The particular tightening of a man not accustomed to being redirected. "He'll want to see me," Dunbar said. "I'm sure he will," she said. "And he will when he gets back. I'll tell him you were here." Another moment of that assessment, as if he were deciding something. Then he put his hat back on and said, "You're managing his house, are you?" "I am," she said. "We'll see how long that lasts," he said, which was not quite a threat and not quite a statement of fact, but occupied the uncomfortable space between the two. He left. She closed the door and stood at the kitchen window and watched him ride out, and felt the cold clarity of understanding that she had just been measured and found, in his estimation, to be a temporary nuisance. She also understood that his estimation of her was not simply personal, it was territorial, and territorial disputes in this country were serious ones. When Caleb came in that afternoon, she told him, plainly, without dramatizing it, stood at the kitchen door, with his coat still on, and listened, and his face went through several things quickly. What did he want? He didn't say. He wanted to see you. He would have told you if it was straightforward. I thought the same. He was quiet. Then he came to the kitchen door. Yes. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. It was a small thing, but she noticed it. Came to the kitchen door because he expected to find a woman alone who'd invite him in to wait, he said. Not to her. Not really, more like he was thinking aloud. He wanted to look at the house. What's in it? What you're like. I know, she said. He looked at her. You handled it. I said you'd be back, and he was welcome to wait in the yard. Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, but was maybe the first degree removed from one. Good, he said. He went to hang up his coat. At the door to the main room, he stopped. Dunbar's been pushing on the water rights to the East Creek crossing for 2 years. He wants it to be a boundary dispute so he can claim access through my range. Maggie used to let him in when he came by, and he'd spend an hour looking around and asking questions. See, she said, he'll come back, I expect so. He'll try a different approach next time. He's patient. So am I, she said. Caleb looked at her for a moment that was a beat longer than necessary. Then he went into the main room, toward his fire, the one that had been lit every evening since she'd fixed the damper, and she heard him sit down in the chair that had become, without any discussion, his chair. The 4th week brought the first snowstorm of any real consequence, though not the worst that was still building, somewhere north of them, waiting. This one came in on a Thursday and deposited 18 inches of new snow over 2 days, and during those 2 days the ranch closed in on itself the way a fist closes, all the normal rhythms contracting to the essential ones. Evelyn had been watching the weather the way she'd been watching everything, since she arrived carefully, with the awareness that in this country the weather was not a backdrop but a participant, and one that didn't negotiate. When she saw the sky change on Wednesday evening, she spent that night making sure the kitchen stores were accessible without needing to go to the supply shed, moved the firewood she could carry to the porch, and checked the lamp oil twice. Caleb noticed. He said nothing about it, but she caught him once. On Thursday morning, when the snow was already coming down hard, standing in the kitchen doorway watching her work, and there was something in his face that wasn't surprise exactly, but was the beginning of a recalibration. You've been in storms before, he said. Not like this, she said honestly. But I've been in winters. This one's going to last 2 days. Maybe 3. I know, I moved the wood in last night. He was quiet, then as if the words cost him something. You think ahead. Try to. He nodded once and went to do what he needed to do, and she finished what she was doing, and outside the storm built, and the valley went white, and the ranch settled into the rhythms of a closed house with a working stove, and people who had enough sense to stay inside when staying inside was the sensible thing. Those 2 days were, in some ways, the most honest time she and Caleb had spent together, because being confined to the house by weather removed the option of avoidance. They could not be in different parts of the ranch. They were simply in the house together, with Pete, who was a cheerful and warming presence, and Roy, who had his own room in the bunkhouse but appeared at mealtimes, and Dutch and Thomas, who played cards at the kitchen table in the evenings and argued companionably about things that didn't matter. She made soup on the first day and bread on the second, and on the evening of the second day she found herself at the kitchen table with a piece of mending in her hands, one of Pete's work shirts that had lost 3 buttons and acquired a tear along the side seam. Across the table, Caleb was reading something. A document of some kind, papers spread out in front of him. He read the way he did everything, with complete focus, no gestures, no sighing, nothing wasted. She sewed, he read. The stove was warm. Pete was asleep in the corner chair with his hat over his face. Storm moved over the house like a river over a stone. And inside, there was simply this: 2 people sharing a table in the lamplight, doing the ordinary things. She looked up at one point and found him looking at her. Not staring, he looked away immediately, back to his papers, but she'd caught it. She didn't say anything. She looked back at her mending. But she felt something shift, somewhere low and quiet, like a foundation settling into a new position. She had come here to be useful. She had come here because she had nowhere else to go and nothing else to try. She had not come here to feel this, whatever this was, this small, complicated warmth that was asking questions she hadn't given it permission to ask. She put it aside. There was too much to do, and too much uncertainty, and she did not have the luxury of complicating what was already complicated. She finished the shirt and folded it and went to bed, and lay in the dark listening to the storm ease, and was careful not to think about anything at all. Storm ended on a Friday, and the valley emerged from it the way things emerge from storms, in this country briefly, sharply beautiful, the kind of beauty that is also a warning. Everything was white and hard and still, and the mountains to the north were cleaner and closer looking than before, the way the cold air after a storm makes everything appear to have less distance in it. She went with Caleb to check the cattle that day, which she had not done before. He hadn't invited her. She had simply appeared in the barn while he was saddling up, in her coat and her boots, and he'd looked at her and apparently decided she would be more trouble to argue with than to take. She was not an expert horsewoman. She was adequate, which was different. She had ridden enough to stay on and manage the animal, but not so much that it looked graceful. She didn't pretend otherwise. She mounted without ceremony and followed him out without comment, and he adjusted the pace to something she could manage without making a production of it, which she noticed and appreciated. The cattle had come through all right. They had gathered in the windbreak on the south side of the far pasture and spent the storm there, which was what cattle did when they had decent sense. Caleb moved through them with the quiet efficiency of a man who knew each animal individually without necessarily naming them, checking for injuries and frostbite and the particular listlessness that meant an animal was failing. She watched him work. She watched the way he touched an animal's flank and what he was looking for, and she watched the cattle accepted his presence without alarm, which told her that he had been consistent with them in a way that mattered. "You've got a good eye for them," she said. He glanced at her. "Just cattle." "No," she said, "it isn't. Some men have it and some don't." "You do." He said nothing to this, but she could see him turning it over. They rode back in the late morning. The sun was already going again. The days were so short at this time of year that full daylight felt like something borrowed, and the cold was building back with the clarity of ice. "Halfway back to the ranch," he said. "You ride like you learned late." "I did," she said. "I was 17 the first time." "City upbringing?" "Mostly." "What made you learn?" She thought about that for a moment. "There was a period when I needed to be able to go somewhere faster than walking." She said it simply, without elaboration, in a tone that invited no follow-up. He didn't follow up. He rode beside her, and the snow creaked under the horses' hooves, and the valley spread out ahead of them in the winter light, and she understood that she had just told him something real about herself, not the shape of the story, the weight of it, and he had accepted it with the same quietness with which she'd offered it. "You'll get better," he said, meaning the riding. "I usually do," she said, meaning most things. He looked at her sideways, and this time she caught the edge of something in his expression that was almost a smile. It was in the 5th week that the town of Harlan Creek produced a more formal judgment. She had gone in with Pete on a supply run, the first time she'd been back to town since she arrived. She needed thread and a specific kind of salt she hadn't found in the supply shed, and Pete needed to pick up a part that had been ordered for the harrow. She told Caleb she was going. He nodded. That was the transaction. In Fitch's store, she was reaching for a spool of brown thread on the upper shelf when the door opened and 3 women came in. She recognized one of them, Mrs. Alderman, the dry goods proprietor, a substantial woman in her 50s with the manner of someone who considered social calibration to be one of her primary skills. The other 2 she didn't know by name. Mrs. Alderman saw her immediately. There was that half-beat the pause before the performance of noticing. Mrs. Thorn, she said, with emphasis on the Mrs. that was too slight to be called mockery and too pointed to be called courtesy. Mrs. Alderman, Evelyn said, we've been hearing about you. How you're settling in. Settling in well, thank you. The other two women won her age. One older looked at her with the particular look that women give each other when they're trying to determine something without asking directly. Evelyn had been looked at this way before. She held still under it. Caleb Thorn's not an easy man, one of the other women said, the older one. Her tone was not unkind, more cautionary. No, Evelyn agreed, he isn't. He had a wife before, the woman continued. You know that. I know. She was a local girl. Everyone here knew her. I see, Evelyn said, and heard in those words what they were meant to convey. You are not her. You are not from here. You are not known. It's just Mrs. Alderman picked up the thread of it. It's a hard life. Some women come out thinking it'll be one thing, and then find out it's another. And then they leave, Evelyn said. And then they leave, Mrs. Alderman confirmed. Evelyn looked at her for a moment. Then she said, I know what the life is. I've been here 5 weeks. I've fixed the root cellar, repaired the fireplace, retreated the milk cow's infected hoof, reorganized the supply stores to make it through winter, and I've fed 4 men breakfast every morning since I arrived. I'm not here because I misunderstood what I was coming to. I'm here because I understood exactly what I was coming to and decided to come anyway. Silence. Fitch, behind the counter, appeared to be finding something very interesting to examine near the floorboards. That's Mrs. Alderman began. Practical, Evelyn said. Yes, it is. She took her thread to the counter and paid for it and gathered her items and said, pleasantly, Good morning, and went to find Pete. She was shaking slightly in her hands, which no one had seen. She stood outside the store in the cold and let the air work on her face and waited for the shaking to stop, which it did, because she was not the kind of person whose hands shook for long. Pete came out 2 minutes later and looked at her face and said nothing, which was the right call. She climbed up onto the wagon. Let's go, she said. Pete climbed up beside her and got the horses moving, and she rode back toward the ranch, looking at the road ahead of her, and she thought about what Mrs. Alderman's face had looked like in the moment after she spoke, not angry, not chastened, but something closer to startled, the particular expression of someone who had delivered a judgment and received in return not anger or hurt, but simply accuracy. She thought, you'll change your mind, or you won't. Either way, I'm not leaving. The thing that changed Caleb or began to change him, because change in a man like Caleb Thorn did not happen suddenly. It happened the way erosion happens, slowly, and then all at once began with a night in the 6th week. She had been awake past midnight, unable to sleep, sitting in the kitchen with a lamp and a cup of tea that had gone cold, and she heard him on the porch. Not loud, just the creak of the boards, the particular sound of a person who has gone outside, not for any practical reason, but because the inside of a house has gotten too small. She sat for a while. Then she put on her coat and went to the back door and opened it. He was standing at the porch, railing, toward north, toward the mountains which were invisible in the dark, but were there the way absent things are always there. Can't sleep, she said. He didn't startle, no. She stood in the doorway for a moment, deciding. Then she came out onto the porch and stood beside the railing, not next to him, but a comfortable distance away, looking at the same dark sky. What are you looking at? She said, a long pause. Nothing, just north. I can never tell the stars apart up here, she said. There are too many of them. Back in the city, you could only see the brightest ones. So at least you knew which was which. The bright ones are the same. Just more of everything around them. That's a good way to put it. He was quiet. Then you were in Mrs. Alderman's store today. She turned to look at him. His face was half in the light from the kitchen window. Pete told you. Pete didn't have to. She sends her husband out to the far ranches to collect on accounts. Came by this afternoon. He mentioned it. What did he say? Put his wife in her place. A pause. Those were his words. I told her what I'd done in 5 weeks, Evelyn said. That's all. No different from telling her I'd done my job. He looked at her. You didn't have to do that, I know. Most women would have let it go. Most women haven't spent their whole life letting things go. She said, and then was surprised she'd said it out loud, because it was more than she'd intended. He was looking at her properly now, the way he rarely did directly, without the sideways quality of his usual attention. What did your father do? He said. She looked at him. He'd heard her that first week, when she'd cut off the conversation about her father, and he'd let it sit. And now, here in the dark on the porch, he was asking. He told me I wasn't worth the trouble, she said. Then he put my trunk outside. Caleb was very still. It was January, she said. 3rd of January. He'd waited, I think, until after Christmas, so he could feel like he'd been decent about it. Where did you go? To a woman I worked for the summer before. She let me sleep on the kitchen floor for 3 nights while I figured out what to do. Then I went to Chicago and took the first work I could find. The laundry. She looked at the dark mountains. The advertisement was on the board there. I'd passed it 10 times, the 11th time I read it. He didn't say he was sorry, she was glad of that. The letter, he said. You wrote that you weren't fragile. I wasn't. I know, he said. I didn't believe it when I read it. I've believed it every day since you got here. The wind moved across the porch, and she pulled her coat tighter, and he stood there looking at the dark, and she looked at it too, and for a long time neither of them said anything. Finally he said, it's cold, you should go in. So should you, she said. In a minute she went inside. She stood in the kitchen and let the warmth come back into her hands, and she heard him on the porch for another 10 minutes before the boards creaked again, and the back door opened and closed. She had gone back to her room by then, but she heard him move through the kitchen and into his own room, and she lay in her bed, thinking about what it meant to tell someone the true shape of a thing without decorating it, and to have them simply receive it, as if it were not a burden and not a gift, but simply a fact. And facts were what 2 people built something on when they had enough sense not to build on anything less. She was still careful. She was not reckless enough to call what she was feeling by its right name yet, because the right name carried weight, and weight in this country, on this land, with this man, needed to be carried slowly. Thought, as she closed her eyes, that she was beginning to understand what Maggie Two Horses had meant. When she said, you need someone who'll stay, it wasn't about the house. It wasn't about the cooking and the repairs and the hoof and the fireplace. It was about this someone willing to stand on a freezing porch in the dark and look at the same nothing with you and not ask you to explain why you were looking at it. The ranch was quiet. The animals were settled. The fire in the main room burned low and warm, and outside, somewhere north of them, the winter was still building itself into the thing it was going to become. Evelyn Hart closed her eyes. She did not know yet what was coming. She only knew that when it came, she would not leave. The justice of the peace in Harlan Creek was a thin, deliberate man named Howard Cass, who had been performing marriages and recording deeds and settling minor disputes in this valley for 11 years, and who approached all 3 functions with the same careful economy of expression. He did not decorate ceremonies. He read the words, witnessed the signatures, and shook hands with the efficiency of someone who understood that the moment itself mattered more than anything he could add to it. Evelyn and Caleb stood before him on a Thursday morning in the 7th week, with Pete as witness, because Pete was the one who had offered without being asked, and Roy standing near the door, because Roy had come along on the supply wagon, and apparently decided that standing near the door was the appropriate way to mark the occasion. It took 11 minutes from the time they walked in to the time they walked out. The ring Caleb put on her finger was a plain silver band that had belonged to his grandmother, which he'd retrieved from the locked box in his bedroom, without comment, and handed to her the morning before, saying only, if you don't want to use it, Fitch's wife might have something. She'd looked at it in her palm. Old silver, worn thin at the underside from years of use, sized for a woman with slightly larger hands than hers, so that it sat a little loose. I want to use it, she said. He'd nodded and taken it back to keep until the next morning, and that had been the full extent of the conversation about it. Standing in Howard Cass's office, saying the words that the occasion required, Evelyn kept her eyes forward and her voice steady, and did not think about what this meant beyond the practical truth of it that she was now, legally and formally, a person with a place. She had a name that was also a location. She had standing in this valley that was different from the standing she'd had the week before, and while she understood that standing was not the same as belonging, it was something she had not had for a very long time, and she allowed herself briefly to feel the weight of that. Caleb said the words in the same tone he used for everything unhurried, without performance. When Howard Cass said he could kiss the bride, there was a moment's pause that was just long enough to be noticed, and then Caleb turned to her and kissed her on the cheek, which was formal and careful and exactly what she'd expected, and she did not expect anything more, and yet she was aware of the warmth of it in a way she hadn't quite anticipated. Pete outside on the steps afterward said, well, congratulations, I guess, with the uncertain cheer of a young man who has just witnessed something he doesn't quite know how to categorize. Thank you, Pete, she said. Roy said nothing, which was Roy's way of saying everything was fine. Caleb went to settle the wagon team, and she stood on the steps of the justice's office in the cold and looked down the main street of Harlan Creek and thought, all right, done. Now everything that comes next is what matters. What came next in the days following was a deepening of the ordinary rhythms of the ranch, which sounds like a small thing but wasn't. The ordinary rhythms of a place are the grain of its wood. They tell you which direction the stress runs, where the strength is, where the weakness. And she was learning them with the attention of someone who understood that the difference between surviving a hard winter and not surviving one was often the accumulation of small things done correctly. She learned that Caleb was at his most reachable in the mornings, before the day's work built its particular weight on him. He was not a morning talker, but he was a morning listener. He absorbed things said over coffee with a quality of attention he couldn't always sustain in the evenings when he was tired. She learned that Dutch's opinions, which came constantly and at volume, were almost always worth hearing once you filtered for the delivery, because Dutch was the kind of person whose bluster was the rapping on something genuinely observed. She learned that Thomas, the youngest hand, was brighter than he seemed and was watching everything, absorbing it the way young people do when they're in a place that's teaching them something they know they need. She learned that the ranch had a rhythm in winter that was different from what Pete described of the other seasons, tighter, more internal, everything pulled toward the essential. Feed the cattle, keep the water from freezing, keep the equipment from failing, keep the people from going under. And she learned, slowly, what it looked like when Caleb Thorn was worried. It was not dramatic. He didn't pace or raise his voice or say he was worried. He simply went quieter than usual, which was a different quality of quiet from his normal silence, a silence that had something working behind it. And in the second week of February, she noticed it beginning. He had ridden out to the North Range 3 times in 4 days, came in later each evening, ate quickly, and spent the evenings at the table with his weather records. He kept a ledger of temperatures and precipitation that went back 12 years, meticulous in the handwriting of a man who had decided that patterns were worth tracking. She'd seen the ledger before but not studied it. On the 4th evening, she sat across from him and looked at it directly. "What does the ledger say?" she asked. He glanced up, looked down again. "Nothing good." "Tell me." A pause. Turned the ledger so she could see it, which was more than she'd expected. The entries for February across all 12 years spread across the page: temperatures, snowfall, wind direction. She wasn't a scientist. She didn't know how to read it the way he did. She could see what he was pointing to. The last 3 years, the February readings had been consistently colder and longer than the decade before, and the current year's column, barely 2 weeks in, was already running below the coldest of those 3. "The barometric pressure's been dropping since Thursday," he said. "Slow but steady. That's how the worst ones start." "Worst ones," she said. "The storms that come from the northwest and don't stop." He was looking at the ledger, not at her. "We had one in 1,881. Lost a third of my cattle. Lost 2 of the Dunbar cattle that had gotten onto my range somehow." A slight tightening of his jaw on the Dunbar name. 1,881 was bad. "The ledger says this one's going to be worse." She looked at him. "What do you need to do?" He looked up from the ledger. He seemed briefly surprised that this was her first response, not fear, not protest, but the operational question. "Move the north herd closer," he said. "They're in the upper pasture, and if a storm comes from the northwest, they're exposed. The lower pasture fence needs work first. There are 2 sections that won't hold if I push 200 cattle against them." "When does the fence need to be done?" "It should have been done last week." He said it flatly, without self-excuse. "I thought we had more time." "What does Pete know about fence work?" "He's adequate. Dutch is better." "Then put Dutch on the fence and use Pete and Thomas to start moving the herd down." He looked at her for a moment, with that measuring look, the one that was assessing whether she understood what she was suggesting, or was simply filling space with words. "The upper pasture is 4 miles out," he said. "I know. I've ridden out there twice. In this weather, moving 200 head could take most of a day." "Then start tomorrow," she said. Early, he was quiet for a moment. "You're not wrong," he said. "I know I'm not." He almost smiled. She saw the edge of it before it retreated. "I'll start Dutch on the fence at first light," he said. "Pete and Thomas on the herd." I'll go with Pete and Thomas," she said. Stopped. "No, I can ride well enough to be useful. You know that. And you need to supervise the fence work and check the southern sections. It's going to be cold. It's already cold. This is different cold." Caleb. She said his name plainly, without heat, without the tone of argument. You're one person. The work is for more than one person. Let me help. He looked at her across the table. The lamp between them was the only light in the room, and in it his face had that quality it sometimes had in the evenings, a little more open than during the day. The way people are when they're tired enough that maintaining their usual guard costs more than they want to spend. All right, Sia said. They started before dawn. The temperature was 21 below zero when Evelyn came out of the house into the dark, and the cold hit her with the particular ferocity of cold at that hour, before the body has properly warmed itself, before the blood has made its morning decisions about what to protect and what to sacrifice. She had dressed the way she'd learned to dress in the past 6 weeks' layers, starting with wool against the skin, and the most important thing being her feet, because she had understood early that cold feet were a losing proposition in this country, that the feet went first and the rest followed. She had Pete's old pair of wool socks under her own, which he had offered without being asked, understanding apparently that this was going to be a day that required more than most. Pete and Thomas had the horses saddled. Pete handed her the reins of the roan mare she'd been using, a steady animal with short-coupled gaits that were comfortable in deep snow, and she swung up and settled herself, and they moved out of the yard in the pre-dawn dark, following the fence line north. The upper pasture was 4 miles out and uphill, and the cattle were scattered across it in the drifted patterns of animals that have been sheltering in the same rough spots for 2 months. Moving them down was work, not dangerous work, but the kind that required patience and consistency and the willingness to be wrong about where the animals were going to go and adjust without frustration. Pete was better at this than she was, which she accepted without embarrassment. Took the position he told her to take and held it when she needed to hold it and moved when he signaled. And what she contributed was presence and steadiness rather than expertise, and she understood that both were what was needed. By mid-morning, they had most of the herd moving. By early afternoon, the lead animals were coming through the repaired section of lower fence. She could see from a distance that Dutch had worked fast and well and filtering into the lower pasture. Thomas's horse had pulled up lame around noon, and he was walking it back slowly, which meant she and Pete were finishing the gather alone, which meant it took longer than it should have. Caleb appeared at 3 in the afternoon, coming up from the south on his big gray horse, and she saw him register the progress of the herd and then find her in the field and make some assessment she couldn't read from that distance. He rode over. Thomas's horse? Picked up something in the snow, she said. Around noon, he walked it back. You two finished this. We finished most of it. There are maybe 15 head still scattered in the northeast corner. Pete went up after them. Caleb looked at her. Her face was cold to the point where she had stopped feeling her ears half an hour ago, and she knew her cheeks were the color of something that had been left in the cold too long, and she was tired in the particular way of outdoor cold work, which is a tiredness that lives in the joints and the deep muscles rather than the surface. Go back, he said. Pete and I will finish. Go back and get warm. He said it without room for argument, but also without harshness. It was the voice of a man who was not dismissing her, but was looking at the color of her face and making a medical decision. She went. She was too cold to argue, which she acknowledged privately was probably the point. She got back to the ranch and managed the horse herself, untacked her, rubbed her down, gave her feed, and then went inside and stood at the kitchen stove until she stopped shaking, which took longer than she would have liked to admit. Her left ear came back to feeling like a slow burn, and her fingers ached as they warmed. And she stood there and let it all happen, because discomfort that was temporary was not a problem. It was just discomfort. She had supper on the table by the time they came in, all 3 of them, Pete and Thomas and Caleb, moving with the particular weight of men who have worked outdoors in deep cold all day. They ate without much talking. Thomas fell asleep in his chair before dessert, which would have been funny if she hadn't been calculating how close to falling asleep in her own chair she was. Caleb, at the end of the meal, said, "The herd's down. Fence is holding. If the storm comes in the next 3 days, we'll be in reasonable shape." And after 3 days, she said. He looked at her. "We'll manage what we can manage." It was not reassuring exactly, but it was honest, and she had learned to value his honesty over reassurance, because his reassurance would have meant he was telling her what she wanted to hear, which was not his nature and would not have been believable. Cleared the table. He sat with his coffee and looked at the wall in the manner of a man working through tomorrow's decisions. And she let him think, and the house was warm, and outside the wind had begun to pick up from the northwest, with a slight but perceptible change in its quality, lower, more insistent, the sound of something that had made up its mind. Storm arrived on a Sunday. It did not arrive the way the earlier storm had arrived, with the gradual drama of darkening skies and building wind that gave you time to prepare. This one came in the night, and when Evelyn woke at 5 in the morning, the sound outside the house was like nothing she had heard in her 6 weeks on the Thorn Ranch. It was not loud in the way of a thunderstorm or a tornado. It was loud in the way of something enormous that had decided to be relentless, a sound that was less like weather and more like pressure, constant and total, and in every direction at once. She got up and went to the window and could see nothing. Not the barn, not the corrals, not the fence line 10 yards from the house. Just white, moving fast, horizontal, like the world outside the glass had been replaced with static. She dressed and went to the kitchen and built the fire and started coffee, because those were the first things. And while she was doing them, Caleb came through the door from outside, already in his coat, already covered in snow that was melting off him in sheets. "How bad?" she said. "Worse than 81, he said. Stood at the stove and let the heat reach him, and his face was the color and texture of a man who had been outside in this for 20 minutes. Told her he'd gone out to check the barn and the stock and the situation before he'd come to tell her about it. "Cattle," she said. "Herds together in the lower pasture, windbreaks holding. They'll be all right if it doesn't last more than 2 days. He paused. "Going to last more than 2 days. She poured him coffee. He wrapped both hands around the mug. "The North herd," he said. "The 15 Pete and I couldn't bring down. Friday evening I was going to get them yesterday. I didn't." She looked at him. "Where are they?" "Northeast corner. Exposed." He said it without decoration. "If they're against the upper fence, they might be all right. They've drifted north of it." He stopped. "Then we need to get them," she said. "Storms—" "I know what the storm is. Where would they have gone?" He was quiet for a moment. "There's a draw about a mile northeast of the upper fence. Low ground. If they got spooked and moved north, they'd follow the terrain and end up there. It's sheltered from 3 sides, but open to the northwest, which is where this is coming from. So we have to go north." "I have to go north," he said. "Caleb." No, he said it without the harshness of refusal, but with the firmness of a decision already made. "This is not the same as moving the main herd in manageable weather. This is a full storm in the worst conditions I've seen in 12 years, on terrain that's dangerous in good weather. I go alone. Then Pete comes with you. Pete doesn't know that terrain. Then No," he said again, and this time it was harder. "You know what you can do on this ranch, and I've told you it's more than I expected. But this is not something you can do, and telling me otherwise doesn't change the terrain or the weather." He set down his coffee. "I need you here. The house needs tending. The barn stock needs seeing to. Pete and Thomas and Roy are going to need—" "Caleb," her voice was quiet, steady. "What if you don't come back?" He looked at her. "What if you go out there, and the storm does what this kind of storm does?" She said it plainly, because she could not say it. "What's the plan then?" He held her gaze for a long moment. "Then Pete runs the ranch until spring." It was the most brutal kind of practicality, and it landed in the room like something thrown. "It's not good enough," she said. "It's what I have," he said. And then he went to the door and pulled on his coat and his extra layer and his hat with the flaps down. And she stood in the kitchen and watched him go out into the white nothing. And the door closed. And the sound of the storm came through the walls like it was looking for a way in. Pete was already in the barn when she got there. 20 minutes later. He had heard Caleb go out and had followed, and was standing in the barn aisle with the particular look of a young man who has done the arithmetic and doesn't like the answer. "He went north," Pete said. "I know. In this I know." Pete rubbed the back of his neck. "How far out is that draw?" "About a mile past the upper fence. Maybe 5 miles from here total." Pete looked at the open barn doors, at the storm beyond them. He was 20 years old, and he had been on this ranch for 2 seasons, and he was trying, she could see, to figure out what the right thing was in a situation where all the options were bad. "He's been in worse," Pete said, but he didn't sound like he believed it. "Pete," she said, "get the barn stock fed and watered. Make sure the cows have what they need. Then go check on Roy and Thomas and make sure they're not doing anything stupid. What are you going to do?" "I'm going to be here," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he went to get the feed because she had said it in a tone that didn't invite further questions. She went back to the house. She spent the next 2 hours keeping the stove going, keeping the house warm, keeping the coffee ready, and standing at the kitchen window at intervals of about 20 minutes, looking out at the white, nothing in the direction of north. Time she looked, she saw the same thing, Nothing. White and moving and opaque. At 10 in the morning, she made food for the hands, and they came in and ate and went back out. At noon, she made more coffee and stood at the window and felt the thing she had been holding down, since the door had closed that morning, beginning to rise in her chest, which was not panic. She did not allow herself panic, but was something adjacent to it, something that had her name on it and was asking for her attention. He had been out for 5 hours. The temperature outside was, by her best guess, from the thermometer on the porch railing, which she'd checked at 8, somewhere around 30 below. The storm had not let up. It had, if anything, gotten worse through the late morning, the wind taking on that particular unbroken quality that meant it had settled in for the duration. One of the horses was dead. That was what Pete told her at noon, coming in from the barn with snow still falling from his shoulders. Not Caleb's horse. Caleb had taken his gray, the most reliable animal on the ranch. One of the others, an older mare who had been off her feed for a week, and whose lungs hadn't been right since the first cold snap. It was not, Pete said, the storm that had done it. She had been going. The storm had just made the decision final. All right, Evelyn said. Not now, she said. We'll deal with it when this is done. Pete nodded, poured himself coffee, and stood at the stove. And they didn't talk. And the storm pushed at the house, and 1 o'clock came and went. 2 in the afternoon, she made up her mind. She did it without drama and without extended deliberation, because she had been moving toward it since 10 in the morning, and the only thing she'd been doing since then was making sure it was the right decision, rather than the emotional one. By 2 o'clock, she had enough information to know the difference. He had been out for 8 hours. The storm was not breaking. The distance to the draw was 5 miles in conditions where you could not see your hand in front of your face. He knew the terrain, and she did not, which was the argument against going. But he was alone, which was the argument for it, and she was not willing to sit in this kitchen until Pete came in and told her they'd found him when the storm cleared. She told Pete what she was doing. He stared at her. You can't. I can follow the fence line north, she said. There the whole way to the upper pasture. I can't get turned around if I have the fence. The fence doesn't go all the way to the draw. It goes to the upper pasture. From there I can... Evelyn. He used her name, which he almost never did. You don't know what's between the upper fence and the draw. Then tell me, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he went to the table and found a piece of paper and a pencil and drew her a rough map of the terrain, talking while he drew the upper fence line, terrain beyond, the way the draw sat in the low ground. The landmarks he could identify even in a whiteout if she knew to look for them. A rock formation shaped like a broken chair on the east side of the draw. A stand of 3 dead cottonwoods that were tall enough to be visible even in heavy snow if you were within 200 yards. She studied the map until she had it in her head. Then she dressed everything she had, every layer, her heaviest coat, the wool scarf wound twice around her face leaving only her eyes, her gloves inside the heavy mittens she'd bought in Laramie, on a whim she hadn't quite understood at the time but understood now. She tied a rope to the saddle horn, 30 feet of it, because Pete told her to. What's the rope for? She said. In a whiteout you can lose your sense of which way is back, Pete said. He was helping her saddle the roan, quickly, with the suppressed urgency of someone who has made a decision to help, even though he believes the thing being helped is going to get someone killed. If you find him and he can't ride, you tie the other end to his horse and lead. If you lose your bearings, stop and let the mare stand horses find their way home. I'll remember that. If you're not back by dark. Don't tell Caleb I made you help me, she said. He'll take it out on you. Pete looked at her. Then, despite everything, he almost smiled. He's not going to take anything out on anyone if we don't find him. She climbed up. The roan stood steady under her, which she had learned to read as a sign of an animal's good. Some horses fell apart in storms, and some simply waited for direction. One waited. She rode out of the barn into the white. Fence line was the only thing that existed. She had thought, intellectually, that she understood what a whiteout was. She had been wrong. There was no sky and no ground and no horizon. There was only the white and the wind and the constant hammering of the cold. And if she had not had the fence posts appearing at intervals of maybe 30 feet, each one gray and barely visible until she was almost on top of it, she would have had no evidence at all that the world was still organized in any coherent way. She kept her left hand on the fence wire when she could reach it. When the drifts were too deep and the fence went below the snow, she counted the posts and held the direction in her body, in her posture, in the horse's movement. The roan moved steadily, neither fast nor reluctant, the way a good horse moves when it understands that you need it to work. couldn't feel her left hand. She became aware of this somewhere around the second mile. She could see it, wrapped around the fence wire, but the sensation had gone. She moved the hand to the saddle horn and flexed it inside the mitten until the blood came back enough to confirm. The hand was still functional, and then she put it back on the fence. She thought about Caleb. She thought about him in the specific way that is not sentimental, but is operational. She thought about where he would have gone, what decisions he would have made, where the terrain would have taken him. He knew this land in a way she was only beginning to, but she had been paying attention for 6 weeks, and she had ridden this direction before, and she had the map Pete had drawn in her head. She thought about what Roy had told her in the kitchen that first week. He just kept working. That's all he does. She thought about the ledger, 12 years of temperatures and snowfall, and the careful tracking of a man who had learned, after the worst year of his life, that paying attention to patterns was the only available defense against being surprised by them. She thought about the chair near the fire, the one he'd sat in every evening since she'd fixed the damper, how he'd started sitting longer than he used to. The upper fence came up faster than she expected, or rather, she realized she had reached it only when the fence line turned east, which was not the direction she needed, and she stopped the roan and sat for a moment, recalibrating Pete's map. The draw was northeast, roughly half a mile past the upper fence. She needed to leave the fence. She looked at it, at the fence post, disappearing into the white in both directions, the only solid thing in this world of white nothing, and she understood what it meant to let go of the only solid thing. She let go of it. She rode northeast, counting the mare's strides. The wind was directly in her face now, which meant she was going roughly the right direction. Pete had said the storm was coming from the northwest, and the draw opened to the northwest, which meant riding into the worst of it. 50 strides, 100. She couldn't see anything. 200 strides, and she stopped the mare and stood. The horse's head dropped slightly, and she let it. Horses could smell things she couldn't, and she had Pete's voice in her head. Let the mare stand. The mare lifted her head, turned it slightly to the left. Evelyn looked left, saw nothing. The mare took 2 steps in that direction, unbidden, and stopped. She trusted it. She rode left. The dead cottonwoods appeared from the white so suddenly and so close that the roan startled sideways, and she held on, and there they were, 3 of them, tall and gray, 60 yards to her right, which meant the draw was another 100 yards to the west set. She almost said something out loud. She didn't. She found the draw by the sound before she saw it, a change in the wind's note, a slight lessening of its force as the terrain broke it, and then the ground tipping down and the gray shapes of cattle appearing in the white below her, and among them the gray horse. He was on foot. That was the first thing she understood. He was standing next to the gray horse with his back against the draw's east wall, which was the only windbreak available. And even from 30 yards, she could see from the way he was standing that something was wrong too, still. Not the stillness of a man at rest, but of a man who has stopped being able to make a decision about moving. She rode down into the draw and got off the roan before it had completely stopped, and she went to him and put her hand on his face. She had to feel for it through his scarf, and her hand had lost its feeling again. But she could feel the cold even through that, the cold that was too deep and too settled. Caleb, his eyes were open. He looked at her. She could not read his expression because too much of his face was covered, and the cold had done things to what she could see, but his eyes were present. He was there. His horse threw a shoe on the ice, he said. His voice was wrong, too slow, the words worked for. Somewhere back. Couldn't find where it went. I was going. He stopped. Seemed to lose the sentence. I know, she said. I'm here. Can you get on my horse? Your horse. I have the roan. I need you to get on her. He looked at the roan. She could see him calculating whether his body would do what he was telling it to do. This was the thing about the cold this deep. The decision and the execution became separate problems, and the gap between them widened. Give me your hands, she said. He extended them. She took both of his hands in hers, her hands that also couldn't feel much, inside the mittens, and held them. And she talked while she held them, steadily, in the low matter-of-fact voice she used for frightened animals, telling him what they were going to do, and in what order, because a person who is losing their core temperature needs a plan that is given to them from outside, because their own plan-making equipment is one of the first things to go. He got on the roan. She didn't let him do it alone. She braced him from behind, one hand on his coat until he was up and had his balance. Then she climbed on behind him, which was not graceful and was not something she'd ever done on this particular horse. And the roan shifted and snorted and then accepted the arrangement. Cattle, he said. The cattle are in the draw. They're as sheltered as they're going to get. We'll come back for them. The gray can come for the gray. She'll stay in the draw. He didn't argue. She wasn't sure if that was trust or incapacity, and she decided it didn't matter which. She turned the mare back the way she'd come, the rope from the saddle horn trailing back to the gray horse behind them, and rode out of the draw and into the white. She found the dead cottonwoods by the same instinct that had found them the first time, some combination of the mare's head and the change in the wind and the particular darkness of them in the white. From there she turned east and found the fence. She rode the fence line south, Caleb leaning back against her with a weight that increased slowly as they went, the weight of a man whose body was making decisions about what to prioritize. She held him upright with one arm across his chest and rode with her other hand on the reins and kept the fence on her left. It took longer coming back. She didn't know how much longer. Time had stopped being a reliable measure. There was only the fence post, and the next fence post, and the mare's movement below her, and the man she was holding upright, and the storm. When the barn appeared from the white, she felt something move through her that she could not have named and did not try to. She just rode toward it. Pete came out of the barn before they reached it, stopped when he saw them, both of them on the roan, the gray trailing behind, and his face did something uncomplicated and young, and she was grateful for it, because it reflected back at her that what she had done was the thing that needed doing, which was the only accounting she had required of herself. He needs warming, she said. Slow. Don't put him near the stove directly. I know, Pete said. He was already moving, reaching up to help Caleb down, and Roy appeared from somewhere with a blanket, and Thomas was there too. And they moved Caleb toward the house with the coordinated efficiency of men who have dealt with cold-injured people before in this country, because everyone who stayed in this country long enough had dealt with it. Evelyn stayed to unsaddle the roan. She did it herself because the horse had earned it, and because she needed the few minutes of ordinary work to let her hands stop shaking. They were shaking badly now, both of them, the shaking that comes after, when the body has permission to report on what it went through. She finished with the horse and stood in the barn with her forehead against the roan's warm neck, and the mare stood still for it, tolerant and solid, and the storm pushed at the barn walls from every direction with the sound of something that had not yet finished with this valley, that had more to say and intended to say it. Evelyn stood there until the shaking stopped. Then she went inside to see what came next. He was not unconscious when they brought him in, which was the thing that mattered most, and the thing Pete kept saying to the others as they moved him through the kitchen and into the main room. He's awake. He's awake, as if saying it enough times would fix it as a permanent fact. They got him into the chair nearest the fireplace, not close enough to be dangerous, and Roy had the presence of mind to bring the blankets from the bedroom chest rather than the ones nearest the stove, because warming a man who had been that cold required a measured approach rather than an urgent one. The temptation was always to throw heat at the problem, but the body that has been shutting itself down needs to be coaxed back, not shocked. Evelyn knew this in the practical way she knew most medical things from experience and necessity rather than formal instruction. She had seen a farmhand treated for cold exposure at her uncle's place in Pennsylvania when she was 12, and the thing she remembered most clearly was the older woman who had taken charge of the situation telling everyone else to slow down, stop trying to fix it fast, because fast was the wrong medicine for this. She came in from the barn and assessed the room and said, "Not too close to the fire." "I know," Pete said from where he was crouching in front of Caleb. "His hands and feet need warming before his core," she said. And slowly, "I know," Pete said again, with the strained patience of someone who does in fact know. She let him work. She went to the kitchen and put water on for tea, real tea, not the steeped bark that sometimes passed for it out here, and found the tin of it at the back of the shelf, where she had put it on her first week. The tin she had brought from Chicago in her battered trunk, because it had been her mother's habit to keep tea for emergencies, and some habits survived on their own, regardless of the circumstances that formed them. When the water was ready, she brought 2 cups into the main room and set one near Caleb's chair, where he could reach it when he was ready. He was sitting with his eyes open, watching the fire, and the color was coming back to his face in the way color comes back unevenly. In patches, the nose and ears the slowest, because they are always the slowest. "Drink that when it's cool enough," she said. He looked at the cup, then at her. His eyes were clearer than they'd been in the draw, which was a good sign. But there was still a heaviness in them, the heaviness of a body that has been doing triage, and has not yet finished the accounting. "How long were you out there?" she said. "I don't know." He said it without the careful flatness of a man being evasive. He genuinely didn't know, which told her more about his condition than the color of his face. "Pete," she said, without looking away from Caleb. "Take Thomas and check the herd in the lower pasture. Make sure the fence is still holding." "In this?" Pete said. "Fence line only. Don't go further than you can see." Pete looked at her for a moment, understood that she was asking him to leave the room as much as some asking him to check the fence, and went without further argument. Roy, who had been standing near the door in the manner of someone present, in case he was needed, also quietly disappeared, which was the particular social intelligence of a man who had spent his life around other people's difficult moments. She sat down in the other chair, the one that had always been hers, across the fireplace from his, and wrapped her hands around her own cup. For a while neither of them spoke. The storm outside had not lessened. It moved over and around the house with the sound of something, with no interest in what was inside it. And the fire in the fireplace she had fixed, that first month, lying on her back in the soot, pushed back against the cold, with the modest authority of a thing doing exactly what it was made to do. "You came after me," Caleb said. "Yes, I told you not to." "You did." He was quiet for a moment. "Pete helped you saddle up." "Yes, I won't take it out on him." She looked at him. "I know you won't." He turned the teacup in his hands. His fingers were red and slightly swollen frostnip rather than frostbite, which was what she'd hoped for. The difference was the difference between a week of careful treatment and permanent damage, and she was going to have to look at his toes as well. But that could wait until he was steadier. "The draw," he said. "The cattle. Still there. Pete will get them when the storm breaks. The gray horse is in the barn. I had the rope on her." He nodded. She could see him doing the arithmetic she had been doing, what was still out there, what had been managed, what was lost. "The old mare died," she said, "yesterday. Pete found her at noon. He absorbed this. She was going before the storm." "I know." Pete said the same. "Anything else?" "Not that I know of yet." He nodded again, and this time when his eyes went back to the fire she could see, the arithmetic was mostly done. And what was left was the other kind, the kind that didn't have numbers. "I've been out there in bad weather before," he said. "It was not defensive. It was something else, something in between. I know, not like that." That was he stopped. Seemed to be deciding whether to finish it. "The horse pulled up and I couldn't see. I couldn't see anything. I knew the direction of the draw, but I couldn't hold it in the white, and He stopped again. "I stopped moving. I sat down against the wall, and I thought I'd wait for a break in the storm." She said nothing. "There wasn't going to be a break," he said. "No," she agreed. "There wasn't." He looked at her from across the fire, and his face in that moment had something in it that she had not seen there before, not the open vulnerability of a man undone, but the more complicated thing that belongs to a person who has been self-sufficient so long that being helped by someone else is a physical surprise, something the body registers before the mind catches up to it. "Thank you," he said. It was 2 words. He said them simply and without qualification, the way he said most things, and they landed in the room with the particular weight of something that had cost him something to say, not because he was ungrateful, because he was a man who had organized his life around not needing to say them, and saying them now was a rearrangement of something structural. "You're welcome," she said, which was the correct answer. And then she drank her tea and he drank his, and the storm kept on outside, and the fire kept on inside, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, which was also the correct answer. The storm lasted 2.5 more days. In that time, Caleb was confined to the house against his will and against his nature, which was a condition he wore with the suppressed restlessness of an outdoor man reduced to indoor existence. He was not a man who expressed frustration vocally. He expressed it by sitting down and standing up repeatedly, by going to the window every 20 minutes and looking at the white nothing outside, by undertaking small repairs on things inside the house that could be done with the tools available. He rehung the back door, which had been sitting slightly off its upper hinge since November, and replaced 2 of the boards on the kitchen shelf brackets that she had been meaning to see to herself. She watched him work without comment. She had enough to do to fill her own time, and she left him to the repairs without offering opinions, because she understood that a man like Caleb needed to feel useful even inside a storm, and the repairs were his version of what the fence checking and the herd moving were for her, a way of turning the anxiety of inaction into something with a result. On the second day of confinement, she looked at his hands and his feet properly. The frostnip had turned the ends of 3 toes on his left foot slightly blistered, which was the expected progression, and she cleaned and dressed them in the methodical manner she used for the cow's hoof, without ceremony, without making the patient feel like a patient more than necessary. He sat on the edge of the bed while she worked, looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man suffering the particular indignity of being cared for. "This is going to be tender for a couple of weeks," she said of the toes. "Don't push them back into cold before they're healed. I know, in the meantime, the warmer boots. I only have the 1 pair." She looked up at him. "Then we'll need to get you another pair when this breaks." He looked back at the ceiling. "I'll manage, Caleb." "What, accepting that you need warmer boots is not a personal failing?" He looked at her. She held his gaze. There was a moment of something between them that was almost amusement, and was definitely something more than the medical transaction they were nominally conducting. "Fine," he said. She finished the dressing and stood up, and he flexed his foot carefully, testing it. "You've done this before too," he said. "Cold injuries." "My uncle's farmhand, I was 12. I watched the woman who treated him." "You watch things carefully," he said. "I've had to." He was quiet. She moved to put the supplies back in the medicine box. She had reorganized it in the 2nd week, because it had been in the kind of disorder that suggested it was used rarely, and put back quickly each time. He watched her work in the way he sometimes did. That sideways attention that she had come to understand was not casual. "Your father's," he said. "Did he know what he was losing when he put you out?" Stopped. Considered the question. "No," she said. "He thought he was losing a burden. That's all he could see by then. By then, he wasn't always like that. After my mother died, She paused. "People go in different directions when they lose someone. Some of them go toward the people they still have. Some of them go away from them, because the people they still have are reminders of the person who's gone." Closed the medicine box. When she turned around, he was watching her with an expression that she recognized, not because she'd seen it on him before, but because she understood what it meant on someone who had lived inside a loss long enough to know the different directions it could take a person. "Which way did you go?" she said carefully. He looked at the window. Storm pressed against the glass. "Away," he said. "I went away." She nodded. She had known this. Roy had told her the shape of it, and she had seen the rest in the way he lived in the unnecessary silence, in the unused fireplace, in the house that had been maintained but not inhabited. She had known it the way you know things about people, when you live close to them and pay attention. "The difference," she said, "between going away and staying away is that one of them is a reaction, and the other one is a choice." He looked at her. "You've been making the second one for 9 years, she said. Not as accusation, as observation. He held her gaze. She could see him deciding whether to be defensive about it, and then deciding not to be. "Yes," he said. "All right," she said, and that was all she said, and she took the medicine box back to the shelf and went to start supper. And he sat on the edge of his bed for a few minutes longer, and when he came out to the kitchen, his face had the look of a man who has set something down that he had been carrying for a long time, and is surprised by how different it feels to not be carrying it. On the 3rd morning, the storm broke. Didn't break cleanly. Nothing in this country broke cleanly, but the wind dropped in the night, and by morning the skies had changed from the opaque white fury of the past days to something high and cold and genuinely blue, the blue that comes after bad weather in Wyoming, like an apology that means it and can't help what preceded it. Pete and Roy went out to the draw at first light and spent 4 hours bringing the 15 cattle down. They came back reporting that 12 were in reasonable condition, and 3 needed, watching frostbite on the ears of 2, and 1 who had something wrong with her front legs that turned out to be iceballing between the hooves, which was painful but manageable. The gray horse had stayed in the draw through the whole storm, sheltered against the east wall, and came down with the herd without difficulty. Caleb wanted to ride out himself and was told by Evelyn that his boots were not adequate for the cold, and his feet were not healed enough for extended riding in it. 3 days, she said. The cattle need... Pete can see to the cattle. Roy can see to the cattle. Thomas can see to the cattle. What specifically requires you to be on a horse with damaged feet in 30 below weather? He opened his mouth, closed it. 3 days, she said again. He walked out of the kitchen in the manner of a man who intends to make his feelings about this situation clear through purposeful movement. But he did not go to the barn, and he did not saddle a horse, which was the only thing that mattered. She watched him go and did not allow herself to smile until she was facing the other direction. It was during those 3 days of enforced domesticity that the thing between them moved from whatever it had been before to something that both of them could feel, but neither of them yet had a reliable name for. It was not dramatic. It was not a conversation that resolved everything, or a moment that announced itself as the moment. It was more like the accumulation of small things over 3 days, in a house where the work of surviving a storm had still stripped away whatever remained of the distance both of them had been carefully maintaining. He helped her with the bread on the second day, which he had never done before. She came into the kitchen and found him looking at the dough on the board, with the expression of a man who has just decided to do something he isn't sure he knows how to do. "You need it like this," she said, coming to stand beside him, and showed him the motion. He watched her hands and then tried it himself, which he did with the slightly too much force of someone accustomed to working with resistant material, and she said gentler, "You're not driving fence posts." And he said, "I know that." And she said, "Your hands say otherwise." And he looked at her sideways, with an expression that was genuinely, unmistakably amused. She had not seen that before. Not the edge of amusement that she had caught glimpses of the real thing, the kind that changed the whole quality of his face, and made him look 10 years younger and like a different man, and like himself all at once. "Better," she said, looking at the dough rather than his face, because she needed to look at something other than his face at that particular moment. They made the bread in silence after that, but it was a different silence than any that had come before. Not the silence of two people who don't know each other, and not the silence of two people maintaining distance, but the silence of two people who are comfortable enough not to need to fill the space, which is a different thing entirely and more intimate than most conversation. On the third day, Pete brought news from town. He had ridden in for supplies. The storm had left them short on a few things, and he came back in the late afternoon with flour and oil and a piece of information that he delivered at supper with the careful tone of a young man who is not sure how it's going to land. "Gerald Dunbar lost his south herd," Pete said, "about 60 head. Drifted into the ravine on the east side of his property during the storm. His hands couldn't get to them in time. The table was quiet. His winter stores are short too," Pete continued. "I heard it from Fitch. Apparently Mrs. Dunbar has been going to neighbors asking about hay." Caleb, at the head of the table, said nothing. His face was closed in a way Evelyn had learned to read as thinking rather than feeling. Dutch said that's his problem, with the directness of a man who had not forgotten or forgiven the water rights business. "Dutch," Evelyn said mildly. "What?" "Dunbar's been trying to squeeze Caleb's east water rights for 2 years. Let him figure his own way out. His cattle are dead," she said. "That's people's livelihood. People who haven't been neighborly. That doesn't change what it is." The table was quiet. Caleb was still looking at something in the middle distance. "We have surplus hay," Evelyn said, "from the move to the lower pasture. If they're short on feed, we can spare some." Dutch started. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. She met his gaze and held it, not pushing, just present, letting him see that she was serious and that she understood what she was suggesting and had thought it through. He was quiet for a long moment. "Then how much surplus?" "Enough for a week of additional feeding. Maybe 10 days if we're careful." "Dunbar hasn't asked." "His wife has," she said. "That's the same thing." Another silence. Pete was watching Caleb with the expression of someone waiting to see which way a coin fell. Thomas was looking at his food. Roy, as usual, was unreadable. "I'll send word tomorrow," Caleb said. "Offer what we can spare." Dutch sat back in his chair with the expression of a man who disagrees, but has decided this is not his battle today. Pete nodded once. Evelyn said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The decision had been made, and that was enough. After supper, washing up, Pete appeared at her elbow with a dish towel in his hands, looking like he wanted to say something. "What?" she said. "Caleb's never done anything like that for Dunbar," Pete said. "Ever. Since I've been here." "Well," she said, "people change." Pete turned the towel in his hands. "Did you know he'd say yes?" She considered the honest answer. "I thought he might." Why? She looked at him. "'Cause he's not a small man. He just forgot for a while that he wasn't." Pete seemed to think about this with the earnestness of a 20-year-old encountering an idea that was going to stay with him. "Huh," he said, which was the highest praise Pete generally offered. Dunbar's foreman came to the ranch 2 days later, on a gray afternoon when the temperature had risen enough to make the snow on the yard heavy and slow. He came alone, on a horse that looked tired, and he tied it at the fence and came to the front door rather than the kitchen door, which was a different statement than Dunbar himself had made. Caleb answered it. Evelyn in the kitchen could hear the conversation from where she stood. The foreman's name was Harris. He spoke in short sentences, in the flat tone of a man delivering a message he finds uncomfortable. Confirmed the loss of the cattle, confirmed the shortage of feed, and said that Mr. Dunbar would like to accept the offer if it was still standing. And that Mr. Dunbar, and here there was a pause. Mr. Dunbar says to tell you that he understands things have been difficult between you, Harris said, and that the gesture is appreciated. Tell him we'll bring the hay over Thursday, Caleb said. And tell him if the water rights question is still open, I'm willing to sit down and talk it through properly when the weather breaks. A longer pause. I'll tell him, Harris said. When the foreman left and Caleb came back to the kitchen, Evelyn was standing at the stove. She did not say anything. He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter. That probably didn't fix anything with Dunbar, he said. Probably not, she agreed. He'll be back to the water rights issue in spring. He will, she said. But you'll negotiate from a different position. He looked at her. Because I did him a favor. Because you did him a favor when you didn't have to, she said. That's different. People remember the ones they didn't have to. He considered this in the way he considered things she said that surprised him, not resistant, not immediately receptive, but genuinely working it over. Your mother teach you that, he said. Life taught me that, she said. My mother just showed me the first example. He nodded. He drank his coffee. Outside, the snow in the yard was softening in the afternoon warmth, and somewhere across the valley a crow was making the particular sound crows make when the weather is about to change for the better, which was the sound of things reasserting themselves after the storm had said its piece. The hay went to the Dunbar ranch on Thursday, as promised, hauled on the flatbed with Pete driving and Thomas riding alongside. Caleb did not go himself, partly because his foot was still healing, and partly because he understood that the gesture would be cleaner without him there, that Harris, or whoever received the delivery, would find it easier to accept from a hand than from the man who was also his employer's rival. Evelyn did go. She had not been asked to, and Caleb had said nothing when she climbed up on the wagon beside Pete, which she had learned was his way of not objecting. The Dunbar ranch was larger than Caleb's, more spread out, with the look of a place that had been built to impress as much as to function. There was a main house with a proper porch, and what appeared to be glass in all the windows, and outbuildings that were newer and more regular than the Thorn ranches. Under other circumstances, she might have found it imposing. Under these circumstances, she found it quieter than it should have been, with the stillness of a place that has taken a hard blow and hasn't yet decided what to do about it. A woman came to the porch when they pulled into the yard. She was Evelyn's age, maybe a few years older, with the particular look of a woman who has been managing something difficult for longer than was comfortable. She was wearing a good dress that had been mended twice at the cuff, which Evelyn noticed immediately. This was Mrs. Dunbar, Clara Dunbar, as Evelyn learned later. Not the Gerald Dunbar who had come to the kitchen door with his assessments, but the woman who had gone to the neighbors and asked about hay, which was a thing that cost something to do when you were the wife of a man with the reputation Gerald Dunbar had. Evelyn climbed down from the wagon and went to her. She said, I'm Evelyn Thorn. We brought the hay your husband's man arranged for. Clara Dunbar looked at her for a moment. Then she said, I know who you are. And then more quietly, thank you for coming yourself. It's a hard winter, Evelyn said. Clara Dunbar nodded. Her eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with how much sleep she was getting, which was the particular tiredness of women who are holding things together that other people don't know are in danger of falling apart. Gerald was, she started, stopped. He wasn't going to ask. I know, Evelyn said. That's why I sent the message through Fitch. Clara looked at her. You sent it. Caleb agreed to it, Evelyn said. But yes. There was a moment between them, the kind that sometimes happens between women who understand each other's situation without needing it explained, because the situations are different in their details and the same in their essential shape. Come in, Clara said. I'll make coffee. Evelyn glanced at Pete, who nodded toward the barn to indicate he'd deal with the hay delivery without her. She followed Clara Dunbar into the house. The kitchen was warm and functional and had the look of a room managed by a competent woman, operating with less than she needed, which Evelyn recognized. Clara made coffee without fuss and set out 2 cups, and they sat at the kitchen table. And the conversation that followed was the most ordinary and the most important conversation Evelyn had had in this valley. They talked for 2 hours about the winter and the cattle and the hay prices and the difficulty of keeping animals alive when the cold came in sustained and brutal. They talked about the valley and its history, which Clara knew in the detailed way of a woman who had grown up here, who could tell you which families had arrived in which decade and what they'd built and what they'd lost. She was not warm or not obviously warm, not in the early part of the conversation, but she was honest. And she was intelligent, and she was clearly lonely in the particular way of women in isolated places who have more going on inside them than their circumstances easily accommodate. At some point, over second cups, Clara Dunbar said, "I said some things about you when you first arrived." Evelyn held her cup. "I know. They weren't generous." "No." Clara paused, and in the pause, Evelyn could see her working out how honest to be. She decided on honest. "I was repeating what my husband said, and I should have thought about it more before I repeated it." Evelyn looked at her. "You're thinking about it now." "I am." "Then that's what matters." Clara looked at her cup. "You came after Caleb in that storm." The story had apparently traveled, which was not surprising in a valley this small. "Yes," Evelyn said. "People are saying," Clara stopped. "People are saying that's the kind of thing a woman does when she loves someone." Evelyn felt the word land in the room. "People say a lot of things," she said. "True?" Clara asked. It was a forward question, the kind you could only ask someone you'd just met if the circumstances had already moved past the normal stages of acquaintance. Evelyn thought about whether to deflect it. "I don't know yet," she said, which was the most honest answer available. "I know I wasn't willing to sit in the house and wait." Clara nodded slowly. "Gerald would have been," she said. And then, so quietly it was almost not said, "He always is." Evelyn heard the shape of that sentence, everything it carried, and wasn't saying. She did not push on it. She simply finished her coffee and said she should get back, and Clara walked her to the door and said goodbye, with the particular formality of a new acquaintance who is deciding whether to become something more. Riding back on the wagon, Pete asked how the coffee was. "Good," she said. "She seem all right?" "She seems like someone who needs a friend," Evelyn said. Pete nodded, as if this were information he was filing for future reference. When they got back to the ranch, Caleb was in the barn doing the work he'd been doing with his foot. In the condition, it was the things that could be done without much standing, which meant harness work and equipment repair. He looked up when Evelyn came in. "How was it?" he said. The haze delivered. "Clara Dunbar made coffee." "Clara Dunbar." He said the name with the careful neutrality of a man who has a well-formed opinion that he is choosing not to voice. "She's not her husband," Evelyn said. He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said in a tone that conceded something. "She's been managing him and this valley and whatever goes on inside that house for a long time," Evelyn said. "And she's doing it without much help." Caleb was quiet. He went back to the harness. "She told me what she said about me," Evelyn continued. "When I arrived, he looked up. She apologized," Evelyn said. "Genuinely." "What did you say?" "I said it was what mattered." She leaned against the stall post. "The valley talks, Caleb. You know that. They talked about me from the beginning. But talk shifts when you give it something real to look at instead." He set down the harness. "What do you want to do about it?" "Nothing dramatic," she said. "Just what we've been doing. Be here. Be useful. Don't disappear." He looked at her for a long moment. The barn was warm with the animal heat of the horses and the cattle that had come down from the upper pasture, and the light through the high window was the thin, clear light of late winter that was finally beginning to carry a suggestion, just a suggestion, of something else to come. "Change things here," he said. It was not an accusation, and it was not a declaration. It was a statement of plain fact, from a man who dealt in plain facts, and she heard it as such. "I've done my job," she said. "It's more than that," he said. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the directness he used, rarely the full attention look, not the sideways one. "I know it's more than that," he continued, with the difficulty of a man pushing past the edge of his usual territory. "And it's been a long time since things here were more than just managed." He paused, visibly working for the language. "I forgot what it felt like when someone was," he stopped. "Try it again. When someone was in the house because they wanted to be there, not because they had to be." She was careful. She did not rush toward the thing he was saying, because rushing toward it would have made him pull back, and this right here was too important to lose to impatience. "Do you think I want to be here?" she said quietly. "I think you came because you had no choice," he said. "And I think something changed." "Something changed," she agreed. "For me too," he said. It was as much as he was going to say, and she understood that from Caleb Thorn, this was not a small thing, that for a man who had spent 9 years building a life around needing nothing and no one, Saying something changed for me too was the equivalent of another man's most elaborate declaration. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right? It's enough, she said. For now, he nodded. She thought she saw it again, the edge of that real smile, the one she'd seen when she told him he wasn't driving fence posts. She pushed off the stall post and went back toward the house. At the barn door, she stopped. Caleb, he looked up from the harness. The warmer boots, she said. I'll have Pete pick them up next time he goes to town. He held her gaze for a moment. Fine, he said. She went inside, and behind her she heard him go back to the harness. And outside the sun was still up, and it was February in Wyoming, and the worst of the winter was past. Though neither of them was foolish enough to say so out loud, because this was the kind of country where saying a thing out loud about the weather was the surest way to make the weather change its mind. But it was lighter than it had been. The days were longer by minutes now, which, in this place and this season, was a fact of genuine weight. And the Thorn Ranch had come through the worst of it, with its cattle mostly intact, and its fences mostly holding, and its people, all of its people. The ones who lived in the main house and the ones in the bunkhouse and the one who had arrived from Chicago in a broken trunk with $11.40 and a tin photograph, all still present and still functional and still, in their various ways, building something from the raw material of what was in front of them. That night after supper, Caleb sat in his chair by the fire for an hour before he went to bed. He didn't read. He didn't work. He just sat the way a man sits when he has arrived somewhere and is taking a moment to understand that he has arrived. Evelyn sat across from him and did her mending, and the fire was warm, and the house was quiet, and she did not name what she was feeling, because it didn't need a name yet. It just needed to be there. Spring came to the Harlan Creek Valley, the way spring always came to that country, not as an arrival but as a slow negotiation. The cold giving ground reluctantly, a warm afternoon followed by 3 frozen mornings, mud one week and ice the next, the whole season conducting itself like a disagreement that both sides were eventually going to have to concede, but neither was willing to concede first. Evelyn noticed it in the small things before the big ones, the light lasting 20 minutes longer than it had the week before. The sound the creek made changing pitch as the ice began to loosen from the banks. Cattle in the lower pasture shifting their grazing patterns, moving toward the south-facing slopes where the snow was pulling back from the brown grass underneath, finding the first thin growth of something green that they smelled before any person could see it. She noticed it in Caleb, too. It was not dramatic, the change in him. It didn't announce itself. It moved through him, the way the season moved through the valley in increments, with reversals, without any clean line between what he had been and what he was becoming. But she had been paying attention since January, and she could see it. The way he came to the kitchen in the mornings, a few minutes earlier than he used to, when before he had taken his coffee and gone directly out without sitting. The way he sometimes stayed at the table after the hands had finished eating and actually talked with opinions and questions, and the occasional dry remark that made Pete laugh in his sudden gap-toothed way. The way he had started, in the evenings, to tell her things about the ranch's history without being asked which family had owned the adjacent parcel or was absorbed. Why the well had been dug on the east side instead of the more sensible west. The particular reason the barn's north wall was thicker than the other 3. She understood what he was doing, even if he didn't have a name for it. He was sharing the place with her. Not practically. He had always been practical about the ranch, about what needed doing and when and how. He was sharing its history, its reasons, its character. He was showing her the interior of the thing he had built his life around. And there is no more honest form of trust than that. The Dunbar situation resolved itself in March, though not cleanly, because nothing in this valley resolved cleanly. Gerald Dunbar came to the ranch himself on a Thursday morning when the mud in the yard was deep enough to be genuine trouble, and the sky had that high, thin quality that meant cold still, but maybe not today. He came in the front, which was different from his first visit, and he knocked, which was different still. Caleb answered. Evelyn was in the kitchen and could hear them on the front porch, not every word, but the shape of the conversation, the particular rhythm of 2 men who have been opponents long enough to have a formal quality to their disagreement, like a dance both parties know the steps to. After about 10 minutes, Caleb called to her. She went to the front room. Dunbar was standing just inside the door, hat in his hands, in the posture of a man making a visit that cost him something to make. He was older looking than he had seemed that first day at the kitchen door. The winter had done something to him that went past the physical, the particular compression of a man who has lost more than he expected to and is reassessing things accordingly. Thorn, he said. Mr. Dunbar, she said, I wanted to say myself. He stopped, started again. Clara told me you came with the hay. You sat with her. He looked at Caleb briefly, then back at her. That was a decent thing. It was a neighbor thing, she said. That's all. He nodded. There was a pause that had the quality of something being decided. Water rights, he said to Caleb. I'd like to settle it properly. What I've been asking for the East Crossing access, I'll put it as a formal easement proposal, in writing, with the county office. Something that gives you the right to refuse or approve rather than just. He stopped. Rather than the way I've been going about it. Caleb was quiet for a moment. That's a reasonable approach, he said. Clara suggested it. Dunbar said, which cost him something to admit and which, Evelyn thought, probably meant more for the future of his marriage than for the water rights. Clara's a sensible woman, Evelyn said. Dunbar looked at her with an expression that was complicated and tired, and underneath both of those things, something that might have been relief. She is, he said. She's been telling me so for 20 years. Caleb made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same neighborhood, and Dunbar's mouth moved slightly. And the front room had the particular atmosphere of a thaw, not warm, not yet, but the temperature where things begin to run that have been frozen. After Dunbar left, Caleb stood in the front room for a moment. Evelyn waited. Clara, he said. Clara, she confirmed. You've been busy, he said, but not with any edge to it, with something closer to the tone he'd used about the bread. When he'd said, she thought ahead. I had coffee with a woman who needed a friend, she said. What she did with her own husband after is hers. He looked at her. You knew she'd do something with it. I thought she might. She's not a woman who wastes things. He shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in the way of someone encountering something they weren't expecting. He went back to whatever he'd been doing before, and she went back to the kitchen, and that was that, except it wasn't that. Because the Dunbar easement was signed at the county office 6 weeks later, giving the Thorn Ranch formal right to approve or deny any crossing of the east water access, which was a better outcome than 2 years of informal pressure had produced. And it came about because a woman had sat at a kitchen table for 2 hours and been honest with another woman, which is how a surprising number of the valley's problems would eventually get solved. It was in April that Caleb said the thing he had been working toward since February. The day was ordinary. That was what she would remember about it, that it was a completely unremarkable Tuesday, warm enough in the afternoon to have the back door open, the mud in the yard finally beginning to harden. She was at the kitchen table going over the supply list for the month, and he came in from the barn and washed his hands at the basin and stood at the counter looking out the window at the yard with his back to her. I need to tell you something, he said. She looked up from the list. His back was still to her. All right, she said. When I agreed to the arrangement, writing to the agency, he paused. I told myself it was practical, that I needed someone to manage the house, and that was the full extent of it. I told myself I wasn't looking for anything beyond that. She said, I told myself the same thing. Turned around. I know you did. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, not defensively, but in the way of a man who needs something to do with his hands during a conversation he doesn't quite know how to navigate. What I need to tell you is that what I told myself was it wasn't all of it. Couldn't he stopped? Couldn't let yourself want more than that, she said. Yes. She set down her pencil, because wanting more meant being able to lose more. Yes, he said it quietly, looking at her directly. After Eleanor and the baby, I decided I wouldn't. I wouldn't want things I couldn't afford to lose, and I held to that for 9 years. I got very good at it. The names hit the room with a gentle weight. Eleanor, the baby. He had never said them before, not in all the weeks since Roy had told her the bare outline. Saying them now meant something. She understood that. And then I wrote the letter, he said. And then I answered it, she said. And now, he unfolded his arms and put his hands on the counter behind him. Now I have lost the ability to tell myself it's only practical. And I want to be honest with you about that, because you have been honest with me from the beginning, and you deserve the same. Kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a meadowlark had started up somewhere near the fence, the first one of the season, which she had been waiting for, since Pete had told her they came back in April when the real spring arrived. Caleb, she said, I rode into a blizzard after you. He looked at her. I did that in February, she said. It's April. I'm still here. What does that tell you? He held her gaze. It tells me you stayed. It tells you I chose to, she said. Every day since January has been a choice. I had enough money to go back by the end of the first month. I'd kept back some from Chicago. I could have gone. She said it plainly, because she needed him to hear it plainly. I didn't want to go. He came away from the counter. He crossed to the table and sat down across from her, which was where he sat every morning and every evening, and he put his hands on the table and looked at them for a moment, the big worker hands of a man who had built and maintained and repaired things for 20 years. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I've been alone a long time and I've built habits that I'm not always easy to be around." "You know that." "I know that," she agreed, "and I'll probably pause. There will be times when I go quiet in a way that isn't about you, when the work takes everything I have and I don't have much left over. I'm not making excuses. I'm telling you the real shape of it so you know what you'd be." "Caleb," she said. He looked up. "I've been here 4 months," she said. "I know the real shape of it. I've lived inside it. You don't need to give me a warning about who you are. I know who you are. I'm telling you that knowing who you are, I'm choosing this." The meadowlark outside went through its phrase again, that clear water sound that belonged to warm mornings and open country. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Careful gesture, not impulsive, the gesture of a man who makes decisions before he acts on them and has made this one. His hand was warm and heavy and certain. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat there for a while, at their kitchen table. In the house she had fixed the fireplace in and reshelved and reorganized and made into the thing it was always supposed to be. And outside the April sun was doing what it did in this valley. It finally meant it, laying itself out across the brown and green pastures with the generosity of something that understood what the dark had cost. What happened in the weeks that followed was not a transformation. That is the important thing to understand. Caleb Thorn did not become a different man. He became more fully himself, which is a different process and a harder one, because it requires facing the parts of yourself that you sealed away and discovering they are still there, still intact, still needing what they always needed. He was still quiet. He still went to silent in the evenings. Sometimes still had the days when the work consumed him, and he came in at the end of them hollowed out and in need of nothing more than food and sleep. He was still not a man who expressed things easily or often. He still had the walls not gone, but doors in them now, and he knew where the doors were, and so did she. What changed was the orientation of things. Before, the ranch had been the center, and everything else the hands, the house, the daily life had organized itself around the work. Now the work was still there, still primary in the way that work on a cattle ranch is always primary, but it had shifted in the larger picture. The work was what they did. It wasn't all they were. Pete noticed first, which was not surprising, because Pete noticed most things about the human beings around him, even when he pretended not to. He said to Evelyn, one morning in May, when they were both in the barn and the horses were being difficult about their morning grain, and the subject came up sideways, the way subjects do, when two people have been working together long enough to talk, without needing to frame things formally, he laughs more. She looked at him. "Does he? Not a lot," Pete said. "But sometimes, yesterday, when Dutch tried to rope that fence post and ended up on his back, Caleb actually laughed. Out loud. He seemed to find this remarkable. I've been here 2 seasons, and I don't think I heard that before." She went back to working the grain into the feeder. "People change," she said, which was the same thing she'd said before, because it was still the right answer. "Changed him," Pete said. "He changed himself," she said. "I just didn't leave while he was doing it." Pete was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone absorbing something they're going to keep. "That's harder, probably," he said. "Usually," she said. "The thing that happened in town in June, the thing that closed the chapter on what Evelyn had been carrying since January. She had been carrying it without making a production of it, the whispers, the assessments misses, Alderman's particular brand of social calibration, the accumulated weight of being judged before she had been known. She had managed it the only way she knew how, by being present, by being useful, by refusing to disappear or defend herself beyond what was accurate. She had trusted that the work would speak eventually, because in her experience, work always spoke if you gave it enough time, and did it honestly. The occasion was the Valley's spring, gathering, a loose annual event that Fitch organized, nominally as a community meeting about water allocation and grazing boundaries, actually as the first chance people had after the long winter to see each other's faces and establish who was still standing and in what condition. Most of the ranching families came, and a number of the townspeople, and it happened on the first Saturday in June, in the yard behind Fitch's store, which was large enough for the purpose when the weather cooperated. The weather cooperated. Evelyn went with Caleb on the wagon, which she had done a handful of times now, into town for supplies, for the county office signing of the Dunbar easement, for a Sunday that hadn't required any particular reason. She had learned the gradations of his silences on wagon rides. This one was comfortable. In Fitchyard, the gathering organized itself, the way these things do, men talking cattle, and range conditions, and the coming season, women exchanging information about the winter and the children, and who had needed what, and who had managed. She was greeted with a range of warmth and a smaller range of the original coolness than had been there in January, which she noted without dwelling on it. Clara Dunbar was there. She found Evelyn within 10 minutes of arriving, which was deliberate, and they stood together for a while near the edge of the gathering, talking in the easy way of people who have established themselves as genuine rather than convenient friends. Clara had the look of a woman who had made some decisions in the past months and was living with them, with the particular resolve of someone who has stopped waiting for conditions to improve before she acts. Gerald came home different after he went to see Caleb, Clara said at one point. Different how? Evelyn said, quieter. More, Clara searched for it. More careful, like he'd seen something he hadn't expected to see, and was still thinking about it. She paused. I think he expected Caleb to be smaller about it, to say no because of everything between them. Caleb's not a small man, Evelyn said. No, Clara agreed. Gerald knows that now. Then, with the dry precision of a woman who has been watching her husband closely for 20 years, it's been educational for him. Evelyn didn't laugh, but it was a close thing. It was Mrs. Alderman who created the moment, though not in the way she'd created the earlier ones. She appeared beside Evelyn in the mid-afternoon. Caleb had gone to talk range conditions with a rancher from the north end of the valley. And she said, without the performance of her earlier approaches, Mrs. Thorn, a word. Evelyn waited. I said something in January, Mrs. Alderman said, when you came to the store, and I've said things since to various people in this town that She stopped. She was a woman not accustomed to the direction she was currently traveling, and she was navigating it with visible effort. What you did during the storm, going out after Caleb. Mrs. Alderman, let me finish, she said. I was wrong about why you came here. I made a judgment about mail-order brides in general and applied it to you specifically, and I was wrong. She said it directly, without ornamentation, in the manner of a woman who, when she decides to do something, does it without half measures. You earned your place here, and you've earned your place in this valley, and I should have waited to see that, before I said what I said. Evelyn looked at her. 50-something years old, substantial and capable, and finally, in this moment, willing to be wrong. It occurred to Evelyn that she might genuinely like this woman in different circumstances, or perhaps in these ones. I appreciate that, she said. I mean it, Mrs. Alderman said. I'm not one for speeches. I mean it, I know you do, Evelyn said. They stood in the June afternoon for another moment, two women who had started as adversaries, and were discovering there was something else available, and then Mrs. Alderman went back to whatever she had been doing, and Evelyn looked out across the gathered valley and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt known. Not fully, she was not naive enough to think one winter and one storm and one conversation changed how a valley understood a person. But she felt the beginning of it. She felt the difference between being seen and being invisible. And after a lifetime of being invisible in the places she needed most to be seen, the beginning of it was enough. Caleb appeared at her shoulder. He had the quiet way of arriving that belonged to men who had moved through outdoor spaces, long enough to do it without announcing themselves. What did she want? He said of Mrs. Alderman's retreating figure. To apologize, Evelyn said. He was quiet for a moment. Then she talked to you like that in January? In the store? And before that through other people? He looked at her. You never told me the whole of it. You knew enough, she said. And I didn't want you to make it into something it didn't need to be. What it needed to be, he said slowly, was for me to say something to people in this town. You didn't have to. Yes, he said. I did. I should have. He looked out at the gathering, at the people who had known him for years, and who had been forming their opinions about his wife since January. I know everyone here. They know me. They know what I think of things. I should have said early on what I think of you. What you've done, what you are. He paused. I was still being careful. Myself. I hadn't finished working out what I felt, and I didn't want to say something that was less than true. But being careful about myself, let other people say things that weren't true about you, and I won't do that again. It was the longest speech she had heard him make, and she understood what it had cost him, and she understood that it was also a promise, and she held it carefully. Done now, she said. It's not done, he said, but I'll do better with it. She looked at him at the profile of a man she had been learning since January, the particular line of his jaw, and the way he held his shoulders, and the quality of his attention when he was thinking about something he hadn't decided about yet. She thought about the letter. 2 letters. The whole correspondence between them. The $11.40. The stagecoach from Laramie and the cold that hit her when the door opened. The battered trunk and the boots she'd picked up off the frozen ground of her father's front walk 6 months ago, in a life that felt more distant than distance usually made things. She thought about the roan mare and the blizzard and the fence posts appearing out of the white one by one like a problem that could be solved if you just kept moving, and the draw, and the gray shapes of the cattle, and the man against the east wall who had been making himself small against the cold and was still there, still present, still holding on. She thought about the fire in the fireplace, the bread, the teacup, the hand across the table. She thought, this is what it is to build something. Not to receive it, not to find it. To build it, piece by piece, out of whatever you have, with someone who is also building, and to discover at some point that you have both been building the same thing without having agreed to in advance. Caleb, she said. He looked at her. Come home, she said. He held her gaze for a moment with that full attention look, the one that meant he was actually seeing her, not the situation or the problem or the practical arrangement, but her. Then he offered her his arm, which was a formal gesture and was not their usual way. And she took it, which was not their usual way either, and they walked back through the gathered valley together, past the people who had spent 6 months forming opinions about who they were and what they were to each other. The opinions could do what they liked. They knew their own answer. Here's what I have come to believe from living inside stories like this one, long enough to understand what they are really about. We spend a great deal of time in this life waiting to be chosen, waiting for someone to see us, to declare us worthy, to confirm that we belong where we are. And there is nothing wrong with wanting to be chosen. There is nothing shameful about needing to be seen. The story of Evelyn Hart is not the story of a woman who waited to be chosen. It is the story of a woman who chose again and again, in the cold and the dark and the doubt, to be present, to be useful, to stay. She chose Caleb before he knew how to choose her back. She chose the ranch when it was cold and ungracious and indifferent. She chose the valley when it whispered against her. She chose all of it not because it was easy or because it gave her what she needed right away, but because she understood, in a way that only people who have been truly homeless understand, that belonging is not something you find. It is something you make, with your hands, with your patience, with your willingness to stay in a place long after comfort has left the room. And Caleb Thorn, the man who had built his life into a fortress against loss, who had decided that wanting things was just a form of exposure, found that the woman who had arrived in his yard in January with a broken trunk and $11 was not a risk he could manage. She was already inside. Not because she had pushed her way in, but because she had simply been so consistently, stubbornly, honestly herself that the walls he'd built had nothing to stop her. Cannot keep out someone who is not trying to get in, who is simply there, doing the work, staying. They are imperfect people who built an imperfect life in a hard country, and they would have hard years as well as good ones. The ranch would have bad winters again. There would be seasons when the cattle prices fell and the worry was constant, and the silences between them stretched longer than either of them wanted. There would be times when Caleb went back to his old distances, and Evelyn had to wait him out with the patience she'd developed from the first month, and times when her own stubbornness was the problem rather than the solution. They would have arguments about practical things that were really about deeper things, and sometimes they would not resolve them cleanly, because people rarely do. They would not leave, either of them. That was the agreement they had made without making it. In the language of actions rather than words, we stay, and we build, and when it is hard, we stay some more, and that is the thing we are building, the staying itself. Thorn Ranch would become, over the years, a place that people in the valley pointed to, not because it was the largest or the most prosperous, but because of its character, the way that no hand who worked there left worse than he arrived, the way that a neighbor in trouble found, reliably, that Evelyn Thorn had already thought about it and had something to offer, the way that the table in that kitchen always had room for one more. Pete stayed for 7 years before he started his own small operation to the south, which Caleb helped him establish with a starter herd of good stock and the kind of practical advice that comes from watching someone work for long enough to know what they're capable of. Dutch left the following spring and came back the spring after that, as he always did. Because the Thorns was where Dutch always ended up when the wandering didn't take him anywhere better. Thomas, the youngest, the one who had the look of a person still surprised to find himself a working man, Thomas stayed longest. He grew into the ranch the way young men do when they find themselves in a place that respects their growing, and eventually there was no one in the valley who knew the Thorn land better than he did, except Caleb himself. When Caleb's knees began to protest the Wyoming winters in the way that older men's knees do, it was Thomas who quietly expanded his responsibilities, and there was no conversation about it, because the Thorn Ranch was the kind of place where the necessary things simply got done, which was Evelyn's original design, and she was proud of it. Clara Dunbar became the closest thing to a true friend that Evelyn had in the valley, which neither of them had expected, and both of them came to depend on. Gerald Dunbar never became warm exactly, but he became fair, which in Evelyn's estimation was more durable than warmth and often more valuable. The easement on the east water crossing was renewed every 5 years without dispute. And Evelyn, the woman who had stood on a frozen lane in January with a broken trunk and nothing left but a direction, she built what she had promised herself she would build. On the night she lay in her Chicago room reading a letter that said, "If you are serious, come." She had been serious, she had come. And the thing she had found, at the end of all that distance and all that cold and all that careful staying, was not a rescue, not a fairy story, not the warmth that magazines promised to women who waited patiently for the right man to complete them. What she found was a life, difficult and genuine and entirely her own, built with her hands, on land she had earned the right to call hers, beside a man who had finally remembered what it felt like to live rather than simply endure. Some mornings in the years that followed, she would stand on the porch of the Thorn Ranch in the early light, with the valley still and the mountains holding their snow even in summer, and she would feel the specific weight of the place, its history, its demands, its particular beauty, settling around her like something that knew her. She belonged here, not because someone had told her she could, because she had made it true, one day at a time, one difficult choice at a time, until the land and the life and the people in it could no longer imagine the shape of things without her. That is the only way belonging ever really works. You don't find it, you build it. And then one morning you look up and realize it has been building you right back, all along, and you are not the same person who arrived with a broken trunk in the January cold, and that is not a loss. That is exactly the point.